Hello and welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with Alex Cheremeteff. You may know him from Twitter, which is where he and I discovered each other. Alex was born a baseball fan and is a longtime resident of Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley. He is a student of the game's rich history and a writer, researcher, photographer, and self-proclaimed baseball history nerd. He loves to post old newspaper clippings, old photos, and interesting old stories which bring to life long-lost games, long-forgotten teams, colorful characters, and everything in between on his blog and on his Twitter account. Not all of his posts revolve around the Philadelphia Athletics, but many of them do, and that's why I wanted to speak with him. Of course, there's the Shoeless Joe Jackson connection. Everyone knows that Joe played for the White Sox, and he was famously banned from baseball for his alleged role in the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Many people even know that before he played for Charles Comiskey in Chicago, Joe played in Cleveland from 1910 to 1915, batting for a record .408 average in his first full season in 1911. But not many people know that Joe was discovered by one of Connie Mack's scouts, and that he actually made his major league debut with the Philadelphia Athletics in 1908. Joe played 5 games for Philadelphia toward the end of that season, then 5 more toward the end of the 1909 season before being traded to the Cleveland Naps prior to the start of the 1910 season. The Naps were renamed the Indians before the 1915 season, and Joe played 83 games as an Indian before being traded to the White Sox. So yes, I wanted to speak with Alex because I knew he would be able to shed some light on Joe's time under Connie Mack, but I also wanted to speak with him because I just wanted to learn more about the Athletics' years in Philadelphia. The Athletics were one of baseball's first true dynasties, and yet they're a largely forgotten team. They had 2 distinct championship runs, led by some players whose names you have definitely heard, and some whose names may be a little less familiar, but all of them are worth knowing more about. One of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast is to tell the stories of the many characters and participants who make up the sport of baseball. I want to talk with players and managers so we can hear their stories in a way which we rarely have an opportunity to hear them. But I have also wanted to use this platform to teach people about the history of baseball and the people and events which made the sport America's pastime. Being a true expert on the Philadelphia Athletics, Alex helps me do just that. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Alex tells us why the game between the Tigers and the Athletics on September 30th, 1907 may be one of the greatest Major League games ever played. We find out the exact type of player Connie Mack targeted to help him build his 2 dynasties. We learn about the many coaches and players who helped Connie Mack be able to manage in a suit for 50 years without having to leave the dugout. And we hear why the team built their new stadium, Shibe Park, less than 10 years after building Columbia Park. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth. So I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Alex and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum website, which is online at www.shoelessjoejackson.org. If you want to follow along, head over to the museum's website and click on the podcast tab at the top. You can also head straight to shoelessjoejackson.org/shoelesspodcast, and it will take you right to the page where you can click on the Alex Cheremeteff episode or any past episode you might want to catch up on. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. At the end of the episode, I'll explain how you can answer a trivia question on Twitter to win some prizes, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. The winner of our last episode's trivia contest was Edward Holstrom. After listening to the Sean Hearn episode of My Baseball History, Edward knew that Babe Ruth set 206 different records during his Major League career. Edward is our youngest winner to date, but don't let his age fool you. He knows more about baseball history than most people I know. Edward, be on the lookout for your prizes in the mail, and thanks for being such an active listener. But now, here's my interview with Alex Cheremeteff. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
Oh, I grew up in Philly and Rochester, New York. Born here, born in Philadelphia. My mom was from Philadelphia, graduated from Olney High School in 1967. My parents got married here at the Russian Orthodox Church at 20th and Brandywine, and I ended up living a block away for many years after college. So when I was a boy, my father got a job in upstate New York in Rochester, so we ended up moving up there. And yeah, it was very cold and snowy winters, a lot of lake effect snow up there.
Yeah.
And I vowed, when I'm through with everything, I'm moving back down to Philly and stuff.
Yeah,
so,
because there's no snow here ever.
No, never. I mean, one thing that I did really appreciate living up there, and I think it maybe more so than living in a big city, was that it was a small enough city, and the neighborhood I lived in, I made a lot of great childhood friends. We all rode our bicycles together. There were sandlots everywhere, ball fields and sandlots all over the place. There was a local mom and pop pharmacy that sold baseball cards and ice cream sandwiches, and we were there every Saturday morning with our lawn mowing money or shoveling snow money. We would be down there all the time buying baseball cards and candy and junk food. But living up there really cultivated my love for baseball.
So who were your favorite players or favorite teams growing up?
Oh, the Phillies were my favorite team growing up. At the time, when I was a kid, I didn't know much about the Philadelphia Athletics because they left here in 1954. So I was always a Phillies fan growing up. Mike Schmidt, Gary Maddox were my favorite players. I loved Bob Boone because I used to catch too. So I was a huge Bob Boone fan. Everybody loved Schmidt because of the power and the home runs and stuff. But
and the mustache.
And the mustache, yeah. But I was a huge Bob Boone fan. So I didn't know much about the Athletics at the time. When I was like 8, 9 years old, I just knew the Oakland Athletics. I figured they were always in Oakland.
Right, yeah.
Living in Rochester, at the time we had a minor league team, the Rochester Red Wings. At the time, they were Baltimore's AAA team. They were the AAA team for the Orioles. And my mom got me a Knothole Gang membership, and I would go to like 10 games a year, and we would sit like 3 rows behind the visitors' dugout. And I saw some pretty darn good talent come through that little ballpark on Norton Street in Rochester, New York. Just for the Orioles alone, I saw Cal Ripken in 1981, Steve Finley, Brady Anderson, Pete Harnish, Kurt Schilling, Sam Horn. I remember everybody was like, Sam Horn is going to be this big slug. He obviously didn't turn out to be. And then for the other teams too. I mean, you saw Wade Boggs. I saw Strawberry when he was with the Tidewater Tides. Yeah, it was great. I mean, you saw some of the
who's who of baseball.
The who's who of baseball, and a lot of those guys are in the Hall of Fame now. And I saw them when they were in AAA. Yeah. And Jim Thome comes to mind. It was actually right as I was finishing high school. He was playing for, I believe it was the Charlotte Knights, Cleveland's AAA team at the time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think now they're a White Sox affiliate, but yeah, I know affiliations change all the time.
All the time, because I know Rochester is now Minnesota's AAA team. Right. The reason why they're called the Red Wings is because originally they were the St. Louis Cardinals' top farm team. So they were the Red Wings. And then when St. Louis left, the Orioles came in. But yeah, minor league affiliations change all the time. Yeah. But yeah, so it's been a childhood love affair with baseball, and something that's going to stick with me the rest of my life.
When you were in high school, you volunteered at a retirement home. How did that really spark your interest in diving deep to do more research into the athletics?
It was interesting. The place was called the Shire at Culverton. I remember the name. And a lot of the guys there were World War I veterans for the most part. It was basically a soldier's home, and most of them were World War I veterans. And this was 1989, I believe it was. So most of these guys were in their late 80s, early 90s. Yeah. Some of them were born in the 19th century. There was Athletics fans, Phillies fans, and there were a couple of gentlemen that actually went to Shibe Park. And this is before Shibe Park was expanded, before there was a pavilion in left field, before they covered the bleachers down the left and right field lines. And I was just sitting there listening to them, and these guys saw Eddie Collins and Frank Baker, Jack Barry, the whole $100,000 infield, and then they saw later on in life, Lefty Grove and Mickey Cochran and Jimmy Fox, Jimmy Dykes. And these are guys I just read about just briefly. Yeah. I knew their names. I didn't know that much. And that from there, that really sparked my interest to go back and deeper into history, because I was always a baseball fan. But it was mostly of today's players. For back then, It was the 80s. So it was those players at the time. It was Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire and Mike Schmidt, Darryl Strawberry, Ricky Henderson. Yeah. But I didn't really know much about the history of the game. After a couple of days of sitting down and talking to those old vets, I started going to the library and getting as much stuff as I could.
And what kind of sources were available back then? Because it's not like there was the internet
There was right, exactly.
So what?
My main sources of information, especially statistical information, was Total Baseball. Were the Total Baseball encyclopedias from John Thorne and Pete Palmer.
Yeah.
And I grew up on those. And I used to sit there eating breakfast. I would get up before everybody else would get up in the morning. I would pour myself a bowl of cereal and just sit there and study statistics. Like I still do today with Baseball Reference, but now I can just go online. But back then I used to have to drag this big book out.
Right.
And that's what I did. And then for my birthday one year, I received a copy of The Glory of Their Times, the famous book by Larry Ritter.
Awesome.
Yeah. My favorite was Rube Bressler because he actually, he was with the Athletics when he first came up. And just reading that entire book, it was phenomenal. And it's something that stuck with me. So between that, Total Baseball, and then later on I got Neil and Constance McCabe, I believe, their book about Charles Conlon and his photographs. So you combine all the historical information, the players in their own words from The Glory of Their Times, and then you see their photos of black and Conlon's photos are phenomenal. It brings just everything to life, and everything was just tied together. Now I've launched a website trying to turn that into a book as well. So it's a labor of love, and it's something that's going to stick with me for the rest of my life. And slowly but surely, my son is getting into it too. He's a huge baseball fan and he plays, so it's turning into a family affair.
Awesome. When you were a freshman in college, you became a member of the Hall of Fame, which gave you access to their research libraries. So you'd go there and just consume whatever you possibly could.
Yes.
How did those trips start out, and did you go with anyone, or were you just going by yourself?
Well, when I was living in Rochester, the Hall of Fame was about a 2.5-hour drive across the New York State Thruway. So I went with my family a couple of times, and then once I got my driver's license, I would start driving either by myself or with one of my good friends from high school. We made a couple trips together. It was like a guy's weekend, and we didn't know what the heck we were doing. We were like 17 years old. We're just first time away from home, just the two of us and stuff, and we were, we loved every minute of it.
Yeah.
It was more like sightseeing and buying memorabilia, like at the Mickey's Place over on Main Street. But once I got into college, I really wanted to get into more of the research aspect of it. And it's just a phenomenal place. I tell people, I have friends and colleagues, coworkers that are baseball fans, and I've never been to Cooperstown. I've never been to the Hall of Fame. And I tell them, I said, man, are you missing out?
Right. I
don't go every year now, but I go pretty much every other year. But before I had kids and full-time responsibilities, it was pretty much an annual trip.
Yeah.
But yeah, their research department there is phenomenal. The staff is very accommodating. You purchase a membership and you just call them ahead of time, tell them what you're looking for, what you need, and they'll pretty much have it ready for you when you get there. They're very accommodating, very nice people up there.
And so when you were making those trips, were you already deciding, like, I'm going to specialize in the athletics, or were you just researching whoever came to mind and decided later on that, it seems like a lot of the people who I'm falling in love with happen to have played on the Philadelphia Athletics, or how did that work out?
Being from Philly, it was pretty much the Athletics and the Phillies, but it was other players too. I mean, I did a lot of digging on Ty Cobb. He's, I think, one of the most fascinating and polarizing figures in the game. There's so much literature on him, both good and bad.
Yeah.
I wanted to learn what drove him. What the man played with a fire, and he just would not settle for anything less. Ted Williams was the same way. He played with a fire, and they both had some traumatic experiences in their youth and their childhood, which drove them to that and ended up driving them to greatness too. Yeah. Where we're talking about two of the greatest hitters that ever lived. But there was other guys that fascinated me too. Napoleon Lajoie, for example, Honus Wagner, a lot of the players, and especially the players from the first few Hall of Fame classes. But for the most part, my wheelhouse was and always will be the Athletics and the Phillies. Yeah. Right now I'm really focusing all of my time and effort on the dead ball era Athletics, Connie's first dynasty. I just find that whole era fascinating. So you mentioned the Charles Conlon photos. Yes. You obviously have respect and adoration for the old baseball photographers. I've read that your favorite image is the Ty Cobb sliding into third base. Tell me about that date. It's August 24th, 1909. Tell me about that moment, what happened, the lead up to it, everything going on there. Well, it was an extremely heated pennant race. The Tigers were trying to win their third consecutive American League pennant. The Athletics were the up-and-coming young team. 1909, Frank Baker, Eddie Collins were in their second year. Jack Combs was coming off an injury. He was on the verge of stardom. They still had veteran pitchers like Chief Bender and Eddie Plank. Jack Barry was starting to come around. So they were on the verge of something great.
Yeah.
But the Tigers and Ty Cobb, they're not going to give up their perch easily. Cobb heard the rumor that Frank Baker was a little soft and a little timid at the bag, that if you came in there with your spikes, then he would back off and basically give you the bag.
Mm-hmm.
Because back then, if you know the gloves, the equipment, I mean, you really had to get it into
the palm
of your hand,
yeah.
or you had to grip it with two hands and get down and tag the guy.
Right.
And more often than not, you would get injured.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of guys would get spiked back then, and Cobb was notorious for that. When he came into a base, it was his base to take, and he was going to take it.
Mm-hmm.
No bones about it. This day in 1909 at Bennett Park in Detroit, he made a break for third base. Baker received the ball, and he went down to tag him. And Cobb made a hook slide trying to avoid Baker's tag because Baker had the ball in one hand and he was reaching over to tag his leg.
Mm-hmm.
As Cobb was sliding by, he was making a hook slide. His leg was raised off the ground, and his spike grazed Frank Baker's arm, his forearm. And he had a pretty deep gash. And that was not the first time those two had tangled.
Right.
And Connie Mack was livid.
Yeah, he said, "I'm not going to prolong my arguments why Cobb is too aggressively inclined on the ball field. Personally, I'm not very well acquainted with the young man. I think it is just his second nature to act mean on the ball field. He probably gets up in the morning with a grouch on, and it sticks to
Right.
him all day.
Right.
And then when the game is on, he gives vent to this feeling by making trouble. I know that Cobb has threatened to get Baker, Barry, and Collins. He did spike Baker and knocked Collins heels over head yesterday trying
Yep.
to do the same to him. He may be a great player, but he's a pinhead in this respect.
Yep.
Organized baseball ought not to permit such a malefactor to disgrace it." So
Connie
he was not happy.
Connie had a way with words. Connie was a man of few words. He was livid with Cobb. But Cobb was exonerated pretty much because there was a famous photo taken by, I believe his name is William Kunzler. He was the photographer for the Detroit News. And that photo pretty much exonerated Cobb, that Cobb did not go after Baker.
Mm-hmm.
Cobb was trying to slide away from him. It was a fadeaway slide. He was trying to basically hook his toe on the bag, and Baker was reaching over
Mm-hmm.
to grab him, and it was just inadvertent, which, like I said, happened back then.
Yeah.
But it happened so fast, and the visitors' dugout at Bennett Park was on the first base side, so Connie Mack was all the way on the other side of the field, and he obviously didn't have a good angle, didn't have a good vantage point there, and everything happened so fast. But once Kunzler's photo came out, Connie kind of backed off, and things died down. But the Athletics and the Tigers had a very heated rivalry starting in 1907, pretty much actually when Cobb got there, but in 1907 it really heated up.
Yeah.
It continued into 1908 and especially 1909, because 1907 and 1909, the Athletics and the Tigers were in a couple of heated pennant races right up until the end of the season, pretty much. So
Yeah, 1907 particularly came down to the final week between Detroit and Philadelphia. And you've
Yes.
said that if you had a time machine, you'd want to go back to September 30th, 1907 to see
Absolutely.
the Tigers and Athletics play. What happened that day?
that was one of the greatest Major League games I ever played. It was supposed to be a doubleheader. The Athletics were trailing the Tigers in the standings by a game and a half. Wild Bill Donovan was the Tigers pitcher that day. He was a starting pitcher. He was a Philadelphia native, lived in Philadelphia. A bunch of his friends and acquaintances presented him with a floral horseshoe before the game at Columbia Park in Philadelphia. And there's actually a famous photo that I actually have in my on my Twitter feed of the pregame ceremony where Donovan is being presented. You can see Ty Cobb on the far, a young Ty Cobb on the far right of the photo.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's supposed to be a doubleheader. Donovan started the game. The Athletics jumped out to a huge lead. They jumped out to a 7-1 lead after a few innings. They had pummeled Donovan. But Huey Jennings, the Tigers manager, knowing that the Tigers had to win because the Athletics were coming hard, they had to win the game. Curiously, unlike today where they would have pulled him after like 2 or 3 runs, he left him in there after he was hit hard by the A's. And the reason why Jennings left him in there is because he was pitching in front of his friends and family at home, and Jennings didn't want to show him up, so he left him in the game. He pretty much decided, you know what, this game's lost. We'll try again in game 2. And Jennings was going to start Donovan in game 2 as well. So the Athletics scored 7 runs. They're up 7-1. The Tigers started chipping away, and they ended up catching up, and they got to within 2 runs going into the 9th inning. By then, Connie Mack had replaced Eddie Plank with Rube Waddell. Nobody knew at the time, but this ended up being the second to last game of his career in Philadelphia. Mack had really grown tired of his act. I mean, he'd been putting up with this BS since 1902.
Right.
And
we'll get to that for sure.
Oh, yeah. Mack had been putting up with him and his catcher, his partner, Ossie Schreckengost, for quite a while. And he was finally fed up with it. And the A's needed him. The Athletics needed Waddell down the stretch in 1907. And he was basically non-existent. He would disappear for a while, for a couple of days. They would have to go find him. When he did pitch, he wasn't very effective. But on this day, he came in relief of Eddie Plank. This was actually a pretty good day for him. But in the ninth inning, with a runner on first base and Ty Cobb coming up, Waddell needed 2 more outs to tie down the game and move that much closer to the Tigers, and then play the second game of the doubleheader with a chance to move into first place. Mm-hmm. So with a count of no balls and 1 strike, I believe it was, he hung a curveball to Ty Cobb, and Cobb hammered it over the right field wall onto 29th Street. It didn't take much to hit a ball over the right field wall at Columbia Park. It was kind of like Baker Bowl. It was shoehorned into a small city block. Mm-hmm. And right field was short, just like it was in the Phillies park. But at the time, it was still, not many home runs were hit over the wall in those ballparks then. And Cobb hammered it over the wall for a home run to tie the game at 7. Cobb said it was the most dramatic game he had ever played in. It was the favorite home run of his career. The Tigers took the lead again later in the game. The Athletics came back to tie the game. It ended up finishing a 9-9 tie after 17 innings. The crazy thing is, and today's fans won't believe it, but Bill Donovan pitched a complete game.
Right.
And there was a statistician for the Philadelphia Record, I believe it was, the newspaper, that kept track of all the pitches in the game. Eddie Plank and Rube Waddell combined to throw close to 200 pitches that game. Bill Donovan pitched a complete game, threw 231 pitches. After being down 7-1 early.
Right.
Huey Jennings stuck with him. Donovan settled down, and he ended up pitching a 17-inning complete game, throwing 231 pitches.
Insane.
That game also featured an interesting portion, I believe it was the 15th inning, where there was an overfull crowd. Columbia Park could basically seat comfortably around 9,000 people. It was a small wooden ballpark. But there was over 24,000 people that paid admission, and there was about 10,000 people that barged in through the center field gate, and that they had to rope off the outfield. So the ground rules were much different that day. There was a bunch of ground rule doubles that were hit that day. Mm-hmm. So I believe it was Harry Davis that hit a ball. There was a police officer that was there trying to keep the crowd from encroaching onto the field past the ropes. And as the police officer was trying to get out of the way, I think it was Sam Crawford. He camped under the ball, and Crawford was either bumped or he thought the cop was going to run into him, but the ball dropped and bounced into the crowd for what should have been a ground rule double. The second base umpire went out he didn't say anything. The Tigers immediately kicked up a fuss. They wanted an appeal. They said that Crawford was interfered with. So they appealed to the home plate umpire, who was Silk O'Laughlin. And Silk and Connie were 2 hot-tempered Irish boys that had some disagreements in the past. And O'Laughlin, who was behind home plate, ruled that Crawford indeed was interfered with. So the batter was out. A melee ensued. Claude Rossman, the Tigers' first baseman, got into a fistfight with Monty Cross, who was a shortstop for the Athletics. Cooler heads prevailed. The umpires and the police restored order. The game continued, and the very next batter hit a ground rule double, which would have won the game for the Athletics in 15 innings. But they didn't score. They played 2 more innings. After 17 innings, the game ended up, it was just too dark to see the ball. They couldn't play any longer.
Right.
So the game was called. It ended in a 9-9 tie. And they never played the second game.
Right.
They decided that if the second game would need to be made up, they would make it up later in the year. But the Athletics went on a road trip. The Tigers went to Washington, I believe it was, where they took care of business against the Senators. And the Athletics lost some ground by losing a few games to the Browns.
Right.
So the Tigers ended up winning the pennant and going on to the World Series that year. But Connie Mack, from everything that I've read, he pretty much never forgave Silk O'Laughlin. And O'Laughlin died in 1918 from the Spanish flu. And they never really made up. And Connie said that game really stuck with him for quite a long time.
Yeah.
I've seen a photo in the newspaper of the scene outside of the ballpark, just the mass of people that couldn't get in.
Right.
They were just standing out there, like 20,000 people that were outside of the ballpark couldn't get in.
Let alone the 3-time capacity.
3 times and then the rooftops in the outfield on 30th Street and in Oxford Street, they were just parked up there on the rooftops.
Right.
So it was quite the scene. It was one of the most interesting games in Major League history, to say the least.
Yeah. So let's go back to the creation of the franchise. So this happened in 1901 when Ben Johnson decided that to compete with the National League, it made sense to remove teams in 4 poorly performing cities and replacing them with teams on the East Coast. So the teams in Indianapolis, Kansas City, Buffalo, and Minneapolis were replaced by clubs in Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Why did the franchise in Philadelphia choose the name The Athletics?
Well, the Athletics name goes back a ways in Philadelphia. There was some amateur teams back in the 1860s that were called the Athletics. They were called the Athletic Club of Philadelphia. There was a Philadelphia Athletics and a National Association, and then there was the Philadelphia Athletics and the American Association. And then there was a Philadelphia Athletics team in 1876, the first year of the National League. That team only lasted 1 year. Philadelphia did not have a Major League Baseball team until the Phillies in 1883. So when the city of Philadelphia was awarded an American League franchise, a charter franchise in 1901, they picked the name The Athletics. That was a name that had been used for many, many years. And Connie Mack was thought to be going to Boston to be the manager up there because he was a Massachusetts guy, born and raised in Massachusetts.
Right.
But Johnson decided that he needed Mack in Philadelphia. So Mack would run the team, run the business, but what they needed was financial backing. So they would need to find a business partner, somebody who would bankroll the team. Originally, the man who pretty much bankrolled half of the American League in the beginning was Charles Summers, who was a coal baron from Cleveland, and he was the owner of they were the Cleveland Blues, then the Broncos, the Naps, and we now know them as the Indians.
Right.
But Summers and his money basically helped get the American League off the ground.
Which is interesting because at a certain point, he was out of money and needed to sell off players, which is why Shoeless Joe Jackson made it to the White Sox. And,
Right, exactly. And then Benjamin Scheib, who was business partners with Alfred Reach, they made baseballs and sporting goods. But Benjamin Scheib was a very well-respected businessman in Philadelphia. He was a sporting goods magnate. He made all kinds of equipment. He made baseballs. And he had deep pockets. He and Connie Mack formed a partnership, and Scheib was basically the main financial backer of the club and the primary owner, whereas Connie was basically in charge of all the baseball of the team, not only managing, but he was pretty much the general manager, the business manager, and everything else that was baseball related.
Yeah.
And Scheib basically provided the money for them.
So on January 24th, 1901, the A's officially hired Connie Mack, and he had to kind of scramble to put together a new team that would be ready to compete in time for the beginning of the season. He intentionally pursued players who were not only educated, but college educated, which wasn't super common in the early 1900s, and he specifically valued high baseball IQ, especially players with a high on-base percentage. In fact, 5 of the top 20 lifetime on-base percentage leaders in Major League Baseball history played for Mack during their careers.
Absolutely.
In 1902, the Athletics win their first of 9 pennants under Connie Mack, and John McGraw helped introduce the White Elephant. Can you tell us that story and why 118 years later we're still using that logo as the Athletic franchise mascot?
Well, John McGraw made his name with the old National League Baltimore Orioles. He was on a team, Wee Willie Keeler, Huey Jennings, Ned Hanlon. They played a rough brand of baseball, going first to third, spiking ball players, overturning ball players, trying to break up a double play, savaging umpires. They were rough. And when Ben Johnson started the American League, one of the main goals was a more family-friendly brand of baseball, because the National League was so rough and dysfunctional, and the National League ownership was dysfunctional. The hierarchy was dysfunctional.
But they had no reason to clean it up because they basically had a monopoly.
Right, exactly. They were the only major league.
Yeah.
And they had 12 teams, which was kind of cumbersome. And then they contracted. They got rid of 4 franchises. They got down to 8. And when that happened, Johnson, who was running the Western League at the time, which was all teams in the Midwest, saw an opportunity. So in 1900, he changed the name from the Western League to the American League with designs on becoming a major league. So When he started the American League, John McGraw ended up going to the new Baltimore Orioles in the American League as their third baseman and then manager. But McGraw wouldn't change his style. And that drove Johnson nuts because Johnson wanted civility. He wanted his players to show umpires respect. He didn't want them to be antagonists. And McGraw wouldn't change. So Van Johnson kept suspending him, fining him, belittling McGraw in the press. And McGraw finally had enough. So he jumped the American League Baltimore Orioles in July of 1902 and eventually landed in New York with the New York Giants. And his goal was to do as much harm to the American League as possible and to really stick it to Van Johnson.
Right.
And McGraw wasn't a big fan of Connie Mack either because Connie Mack was everything that John McGraw wasn't. I mean, they couldn't be more different.
Right.
And McGraw was envious of the way the Athletics ran things. They were family friendly. Mack was very soft-spoken. He liked the college-educated players like we had talked about. McGraw and his team, it was the opposite. So he was interviewed in July of 1902 as he got to New York. And he basically wanted to do as much damage to the American League as possible. So, and I have a quote here, which basically gave birth to the White Elephant, which the Athletics still have as their mascot to this day. So this is McGraw's quote from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it was published, I believe, July 14th, 1902. "The Philadelphia Club is not making any money. It has a big white elephant on its hands. The grounds are leased for 10 years at the rate of $7,000 a year, and the principal backer of the club, which is Benjamin Scheib, has had all that he wants of it, because he cannot see a penny coming in at the gate. No money was made last year, and no money will be made this year." Now, obviously, that was not true.
Right, of course
That was not true, because the A's were very successful. They actually outdrew the Phillies, which were the more established club. There's an anonymous writer in the Inquirer that wrote an op-ed pretty much every day in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I still, to this day, do not know his true identity, but his byline was "The Musings of the Old Sport." And he wrote one of my favorite quotes about John McGraw. He said, "The mouthings of McGraw were just what one would expect from a person of his peculiar mental equation." So, needless to say, John McGraw was not very well liked in Philadelphia after that.
Right.
But what it did, that white elephant comment, what it did was almost immediately attendance shot up at Columbia Park. The Athletics started to play better. They took over first place. The attendance skyrocketed. And Connie Mack and Benjamin Scheib adopted that as their logo. They would sell navy blue pennants at Scheib Park with a white elephant on it. And they made a lot of money on that.
Yeah.
And the Athletics ended up taking off and winning their first American League pennant in 1902. Obviously, there was no World Series that year yet. But the Athletics, they ended up leading the American League in attendance, thanks in part to, McGraw's words, because it basically sparked the team. And Philadelphia fans were like, you know what, we'll show him.
Yeah.
So at the end of that year, in late September, the city of Philadelphia held a parade for their American League champions. And the parade was down Market Street, and it was at night. And electricity was relatively new then, so Market Street was lit up. They had fireworks displays. The parade featured not only the Athletics, but all the amateur teams from the area.
Cool.
The Philadelphia Giants, which were the dominant amateur black team at the time. And from all the accounts, every building had pennants with a white elephant, flags with a white elephant hanging in the windows. So John McGraw created a monster.
Right.
He had the last laugh 3 years later, but Connie Mack would one-up him.
Right.
A decade later.
Completely defeating the purpose of what his comments
but it was
were supposed to be.
Right. Like I said, what he said was that they were losing money and they were making the money at the gate. The fact of the matter was, at the time, the Athletics were actually in the black.
Yeah.
They were very well run. Benjamin Scheib ran the franchise very well. It was like a well-oiled machine. And they were always turning a profit. They were second in attendance in the American League in their inaugural year in 1901. And then they led the American League in attendance in 1902 and 1903. So they were drawing, they were making a lot of money, and they were finishing the season in the black. So it was just bluster from McGraw trying to, do some damage, but it ended up backfiring.
So on July 9th, 1903, one of their star players, who we mentioned earlier, Rube Waddell, left the team. For as great of a manager as Connie Mack is made out to be, his teams were certainly not without controversy. What happened with Waddell?
He would disappear for days and sometimes weeks on end, whatever struck his fancy, whether it was to be in a vaudeville show, to go on a fishing trip or whatnot. He would just disappear for days on end and weeks on end sometimes. And Mac would always end up sending one of his either scouts or one of his, if he had an injured player, he would send one of his injured players to try to find him and retrieve him and bring him back.
Yeah.
But Roux Waddell was eccentric to say the least. He had all the talent in the world, but he was different. He did it. He did his own thing.
Yeah.
He would show up at amateur baseball games because at the time, every little town had an amateur baseball team. He would show up in Chester, Pennsylvania and pitch for their local team, or he would take the ferry over to Camden, New Jersey and pitch for a team over there. You just never know where Roux Waddell would show up. He would show up and pitch against high school kids sometimes.
And when he would show up randomly, did people know who he was, or did he play it off like, oh, I'm just some guy from the street? This was obviously before social media.
Social media, yeah.
It's very possible that people didn't immediately recognize that this is a major league pitcher.
It's possible because, like I said, they only knew him from the newspapers, and the quality of the photography in the newspapers at the time was not top notch.
Right.
So I'm sure a lot of people didn't recognize him. I mean, they would know who Roux Waddell was because he was a star. I mean, he won 6 consecutive strikeout titles in the American League. I mean, the guy was a star pitcher, one of the best left-handers of all time.
Yeah.
A lot of people probably didn't recognize him in the beginning, but he was definitely different. And his catcher, he had a personal catcher. It's funny because a lot of managers today will not commit to personal catchers. The one that comes to mind in recent memory was Greg Maddux. Maddux always had a favorite catcher.
Yeah.
It was Eddie Perez one year, then it was Paul Bacco. But the Athletics, it's funny how it worked out with them because Ozzie Schreckenghost, who was known as Shrek, was Roux Waddell's personal catcher. He was just as zany as Waddell. He was his drinking buddy. They were roommates on the road.
Yeah.
They would go out drinking together. They would go to burlesque shows and vaudeville shows and just stay out at all hours of the night. They liked the ladies. But on the other hand, Doc Powers, their other catcher, who was college educated, was a physician by trade.
A literal doc.
A literal doctor.
Yeah.
And was the personal catcher for Eddie Plank, another college educated guy. And those two, along with Eddie Collins later on, but they were the two brainiacs of the team.
Yeah.
And they really clicked. And Powers was Plank's personal catcher. But the two crazy guys on the team combined to make quite a formidable battery themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Mac put up with a lot with Waddell. I mean, Waddell was a source of a lot of his gray hair.
The 1905 Athletics won the World Series. Connie Mack only used 19 players that entire season. How was that possible?
You didn't have a set number roster like today. You have 25 or not 26 players. If guys stayed healthy, you can get away with using as few as maybe 15, 16 players at the time back then. You didn't have the specialty bullpens. Most of the starting pitchers pitched a complete game.
Right.
And if somebody did come in relief, it was usually one of the other starting pitchers who was in between starts. And usually your lineups back then were the same 9 guys with some backups and some reserves. So it was not that unusual at the time. 1905 was an interesting year because the Athletics were right up there with they went to the World Series. They played the New York Giants, and they ran into Christy Mathewson that year.
Right.
But the Athletics were quite formidable, and Waddell actually got injured at the end of the year.
I wanted to ask you about this.
Yes.
Yeah. There are rumors that he wasn't injured, that he was injured.
Yeah.
What do you think really happened there? Because there were all sorts of rumors that he was paid off to miss the 1905 World Series. What do you think was going on there?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure because, you have so many conflicting stories, but the story that a lot of writers and then Connie Mack kind of stuck to was that he got hurt on a train, actually on the platform, waiting for a train coming back from Boston. The players were all wearing straw boaters at the time on their heads. And Andy Coakley, who was another pitcher on the Athletics, they were skylarking on the platform, and Andy Coakley took Waddell's hat off of his head, and Waddell went after him and fell and hurt his shoulder, injured his pitching shoulder. It kind of seems far-fetched, but, who knows? I mean, back then, it would not be that difficult to pay somebody off because those guys, gamblers came at them with a lot more money than they were making. So,
And there were no consequences if you got caught.
yeah.
We talk about this all the time at the museum, is that people think the 1919 Black Sox were the first team who'd ever thrown a game.
Right.
And that's just
It
so
happened.
far from the truth.
It happened. It happened all the time.
Yeah.
It happened all the time. Guys took bribes to lay down a lot, and it happened more often than people like to think or care to admit.
To the point where Major League Baseball made a rule that players could not interact with people in the stands before a game.
Right.
Because they knew that most likely it was somebody who was a gambler who was saying,
Yep.
hey, I'll give you $50 if you strike out in the third inning.
Yep.
So it was so rampant in
Yeah.
baseball.
I mean, there was rumors there about 1905. There's rumors about, we'll get maybe later at the 1914 World Series, which there was always rumors. But yeah, I don't think we'll ever know what happened in 1905 to Rube Waddell. But there was a lot of historians that tend to think that they would have given the Giants a run for their money had Waddell been healthy, because Bender was at the top of his game. But personally, I don't think anybody would have beaten Christy Mathewson that year. What he did in that World Series will never be accomplished ever again.
Yeah. Just at the absolute top of his game.
Top of his game.
Yeah. So we mentioned earlier that Connie Mack loved college-educated players, and he had heard that there was a great player in Greenville, South Carolina, and sent a scout to go watch him play. But that player's name was not Joe Jackson. It was Joe's teammate, Hyder Barr, who was a graduate of Davidson College. When the scout got to Greenville, he sent a telegram back to Connie Mack saying, hey, boss, I think there might be another player we should look at here.
Right.
So Connie Mack purchased Joe Jackson for $1,000 on July 30th, 1908. But Joe's tenure with Philadelphia wasn't exactly what either party had wished for.
Right. You know, Joe was a Southern boy. Obviously, it's well documented that he could not read or write when he left South Carolina and headed north. Nobody really knows how he was treated by his teammates when he got here. There was rumors that they were joking around with him. Some of them were teased him because of his Southern drawl, because he couldn't read or write. He was a 21-year-old kid. Most of the guys were older, college-educated, Northerners, New Englanders. A lot of Connie Mack's players were from New England or from South Jersey, from Eastern Maryland. And there were not a lot of Southern ball players at the time.
Right.
Ty Cobb was obviously the most prominent, and he was teased mercilessly when he first came up with the Tigers.
To the point where he got into fistfights with every single one of his teammates his rookie year.
Every single one.
Literally. Like, this is not, we're not exaggerating. Right. He literally got into a fistfight with every teammate of his.
Right.
Teammate of his.
I mean, and he didn't come out on top in a lot of those. I mean, he went off against Boss Schmidt, the Tigers catcher, who was an amateur boxer.
Right.
And rumor has it he could drive a nail through a wall with his bare knuckles. And he and Cobb went at it underneath the bleachers on a couple of occasions. And Cobb came out with a couple of broken noses there. Yeah. So Jackson was more mellow, and he didn't fight back like Cobb did.
Right.
He was basically homesick, and he was lovesick because he had just gotten married to his wife Katie that year. And so Al Mall was the scout who went down there to scout Hyder Barr. And like you said, he said, Jackson, this kid is a jewel. He's a little rough, but the guy can hit anything that he can reach. So they signed Jackson. They bought his contract for $1,000, and they bought Hyder Barr for, I believe, $600. And they took the train up together, and they arrived at Philadelphia August 17th, 1908. And Hyder Barr was a known ladies' man. As soon as he got to Philadelphia, he found somebody. And he went out, and they checked the bags at the train station. Hyder went out, and Jackson heard a train headed back south, the all aboard call. And he hopped the train and headed back. So the next day, Barr was, he's like, where are my bags? The bags aren't here. He went back to the train station, found his bags, but Jackson's were gone. So Barr kind of figured what Jackson had done. He told Connie Mack, and Connie Mack sent Sam Kennedy, who was one of his scouts, back down to Greenville to retrieve Shoeless Joe. He did. They came back to Philadelphia, and Connie had Joe penciled into the lineup to start August 24th. He had him in center field to play August 24th against Cleveland. Joe never showed up at the ballpark. He never showed up at Columbia Park. What Joe said, from what I read, was that he hopped off the streetcar and went to a vaudeville show. He wanted to see the sights and hopped off and went to see a vaudeville show. Obviously, Joe told some tales as well.
Yes,
so
he
we
did.
don't know how true that was, but he never showed up. Finally, he showed up the next day, August 25th. He made his debut against Cleveland. Went 1 for 4, drove in a run.
Had an outfield assist.
Had an outfield assist. He also had an error. He did drop a ball, but he did make some tough running catches. and played a pretty good game. So, not bad for your first major league game.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was rain for the next 2 days.
Right.
Before the Tigers came to town. And Joe was staying at a hotel. He didn't have a place to stay at, so he was staying at a hotel. And it was raining for 2 days, and he just sat in his hotel room and watched the rain. And it basically made him very homesick, lovesick, homesick. And everybody was comparing him to Cobb, And I think that was a lot of pressure for him, too.
Especially since those 2 days were rained out. Nobody had anything to talk about except for this huge matchup between the current Ty Cobb and the next Ty Cobb. Yeah.
And I think, he became a little nervous. He was homesick. And once again, he hopped the train back home.
Mm-hmm.
So this time, Mac, instead of sending a scout, he sent Sock Seibold, who was a power-hitting right fielder for the Athletics that Mac had from the beginning, one of the original A's. And he was injured. He was not playing. So, and he was at the end of his career. He was in his final year with the A's. So Mac got Sox a ticket, sent him on a train back down to South Carolina to retrieve Joe.
Mm-hmm.
He found him. He brought Joe back. Joe played on September 8th and 9th. He played back-to-back games. Went 1 for 5 in each game. And he ended up playing a total of 5 games that year. Hit around 167. And Mac saw what was happening. He saw that he was homesick. He wasn't happy. He got a lot of ribbing from his teammates, and Mac just sent him home early. He goes, go home, relax, go on your honeymoon, take some time off, and we'll see you next spring. It was tough for Joe. It was tough for a Southerner, especially somebody who was illiterate, to be up in a northern city. And we're talking, this is 1908, so we're a little over a generation removed from the Civil War. The Civil War. And you're a Southerner in a northern city, and it was tough for him.
Especially being on a team with a bunch of college-educated people.
Exactly.
And you show up at a restaurant and you're holding your menu upside down because you don't know which way it's supposed to go.
Right.
The stories that I've heard is that they'd be at a restaurant together as the team, and a waitress would come up to him and say, hey, what would you like to eat? And he would say, oh, why don't you let everybody else order first? I'll take a look at the menu, while he's holding it upside down.
Right.
So his teammates know he doesn't know how to read, and he's just playing it off. So he would listen to everybody else make their order, and whatever he heard that sounded best, that's what he would order.
Right.
His teammates weren't stupid.
Right.
They saw exactly what was going on, saw right through that, and would just rib him mercilessly.
The only time he really knew was breakfast, because he always loved ham and eggs for breakfast, and he would just order ham and eggs.
Because he knew that no matter where you went, they were going to serve ham and eggs.
Right.
Yeah.
But when it came to lunch or dinner, he would have to go in with somebody else into the dining rooms because he just couldn't. Yeah.
And
it was tough on him.
Absolutely.
And it was really tough on him. He did come to spring training the following year, and he had a good spring. But Connie farmed him out to Savannah, where he played for the Savannah Indians.
Which was kind of an act of mercy.
Yes.
Connie Mack knew you're not going to make it in Philadelphia right now.
Right.
So he could have sent him anywhere in the country, but he specifically sent him to a southern city.
Right.
So you could get your confidence back up and feel like you're at home and go bat 370, you know?
And he had a great year down there, and once again, he got called up later in the year in September. And it was the same thing. He hit less than 200. He wasn't happy. He wasn't happy with his teammates, and Connie knew that he was going to have to let him go and let him go somewhere else. Connie tried, but he knew that he wouldn't flourish in Philadelphia under the current circumstances.
Right. Despite the rocky couple years, though, Connie Mack said that he regretted selling Jackson to Cleveland, which he did before the 1910 season. And the two had mutual respect for each other for the rest of their lives, with Joe saying, quote, Mr. Mack was a mighty fine man, and he taught me more baseball than any other manager I had. And Connie Mack held Joe in high regard, too, because he said, quote, Jackson's fall from grace is one of the real tragedies of baseball. I always thought he was more sinned against than sinning.
Yep.
So even though they only played 10 games together, and clearly it wasn't working out, but they still saw the good in each other and knew these are two good people. It's just this situation isn't good for us.
Yeah. Connie spent a lot of time with him in spring training in 1909. He really got to know him there and worked with him, and taught him quite a bit about baseball just during that short time frame from March into early April 1909. And that was Connie's biggest regret. He really wished he could have made it work in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And being a fan of the history of the Philadelphia Athletics, one can only imagine what if that great team that won 4 pennants in 5 years and 3 world championships in 5 years, what if Joe Jackson had made it? Or what if Nap Lajoie had not had that injunction against him, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court? He could have still been on that team near the end of his career, but, I mean, how great could they have been?
Yeah.
But Joe, yeah, it was... It's funny because Joe was basically like a throw-in in the deal to send him to Cleveland, because it was Maury Rath being sent to Cleveland in exchange for Briscoe Lord, who had played for the Athletics before.
Right.
And Joe was the player to be named later in that deal. And it's interesting because in that trade, Rath and Jackson ended up going to Cleveland, and they would be on opposing teams in a 1919 World Series, because Maury was the one that led off and was hit by the pitch by Seacott.
It all comes full circle.
All comes full circle.
We talked earlier a little bit about Columbia Park, and that's where the Philadelphia Athletics played until 1908. What do you know about that site and what that stadium looked like?
That stadium was pretty much a basic wooden grandstand with bleachers that extended down the left and right field lines. After the 1901 season, they built extra seats on the roof of the grandstand, which are basically, I guess, they would be like luxury boxes today. But they built extra seats up there for the 1902 season. But it was pretty much a wooden grandstand with bleachers. It had a short right field wall. Nobody knows the dimensions for sure, but from the plans I saw from, I believe it was 1907, a city map, I can't imagine the right field foul pole was more than 300 feet down the right field line. So it was pretty shallow.
So do we know if it had a high right field wall?
It did have a high right field wall, a higher right field wall. It wasn't as high as Baker Bowl where the Phillies played, but it was higher than it was in left field. And it had a scoreboard along the right field wall. That was 29th Street behind the right field wall. It was similar to Shai Park in regards to it had row homes beyond the outfield wall in left field and right field. And for some of the larger crowds, some of the homeowners would accommodate the fans on the rooftops. People think that Shai Park was the first. No, Columbia Park. Fans sat on the rooftops at some of the big games in Columbia Park. And that started in 1902, actually. There was a game in August of 1902 where 21,000 fans showed up for a game against Cleveland. The Athletics had taken over first place on their way to their first pennant, and 21,000 and change showed up at Columbia Park. So there's an overflow crowd. People were sitting on the rooftops.
Yeah.
And that continued. The neighborhood was known as Brewery Town. And the reason for that moniker is because all the breweries in Philadelphia at the time, and there was dozens of them. There was dozens of breweries in Philadelphia at the time. A lot of German immigrants came to Philadelphia. All the breweries, most of them were concentrated in that area, around 30th Street, 29th Street, in that area. So there was an aroma. So when fans were watching a game and there was a wind, a breeze blowing from a certain direction, you would have this aroma of beer that would emanate over the ballpark. And for, I'm sure, many fans, it was cruel because Connie Mack did not sell beer at the ballpark. So they would have to sit there, watch a game, and
just smell
the beer.
Yeah.
Yep. It was a small site. It was a small parcel of land. The franchise bought in 1901. The grandstand was constructed in basically less than 2 months. They signed a 10-year lease in 1901. And McGraw was right about one thing. They did pay $7,000 a year, which is a lot of money back then. But it was a quaint little ballpark, and the A's led the league in attendance for quite a few years. And by 1907, when they were in that heated pennant race with the Tigers, Scheib and Mack found that they were turning away thousands of fans. Most days, hundreds, but some days there were thousands of fans that were being turned away. And they knew that they needed a new ballpark. And they were looking at sites in Philadelphia. And whenever Scheib or one of his sons purchased land somewhere, because his sons developed real estate as well. So whenever one of the Scheibs purchased land somewhere in Philadelphia, speculation automatically started that this is where they're going to build their new ballpark. But they were very specific where they wanted a ballpark because their fans were in certain parts of the city, northwest and east of Columbia Park. They didn't come from south of Market Street, which is the east-west main thoroughfare in Philadelphia. So they wanted to keep the ballpark in the general vicinity, the new ballpark.
Even though Columbia Park had just opened in 1901 and was only a few years old, the real reason that they left was because it just was not big enough. It only held like 9,500 seats. Is that about right?
About right, yeah.
So Philadelphia Athletics president Ben Scheib and Connie Mack decided they need to build that new stadium, and Scheib quietly assembled title to the square block of land that was bounded by Lehigh Avenue, 20th Street, Somerset Street, and 21st Street in early 1907, picking up parcels through a complicated series of acquisitions.
Oh, yeah.
Preventing price inflation by masking his intentions.
Yep.
Even using straw buyers to keep his name out of the dealings, like you mentioned, because anytime they bought land, immediate speculation. And people would then raise the price of properties around that, thinking, okay, well, if he's going to come buy this land for a stadium, I'm going to make money off of him.
He was just trying to save some money and keep his name out of the dealings. And where Shy Park ended up being built, the neighborhood at the time was called Swampoodle. And it was basically similar to what happened with Ebbets Field a few years later. It was pretty much a dump.
Yeah.
Nobody lived there. Nobody worked there. 2 blocks away was the Hospital for Contagious Diseases, which was nicknamed the Smallpox Hospital. And there was a certain stigma with smallpox at the time. Nobody wanted to go anywhere near there.
Yeah.
So he knew that he can get the land really cheap.
Right.
And after he assembled all the titles to all the parcels of land in that block, once everything was official, he got the city to drop their plans for what they had in that block. There's some cross streets. They dropped those. And immediately, once the Athletics, and this is just a testament to their popularity, as soon as it became official, they signed the lease and the plans were unveiled as to, the ballpark. Developers swooped in and started purchasing land and building row homes there around the ballpark.
Because they knew,
and knowing that was prime property then.
Yeah.
A lot of factories opened up in the area, businesses, sports bars, saloons, but at the time it was a version of a sports bar.
Yeah.
Matt Kilroy, who was a former pitcher for the old Philadelphia Athletics, actually had a saloon behind the right field foul pole called Kilroy Saloon, where a lot of the fans and players would stop before and after the game for a beer, because obviously you couldn't have it at the ballpark.
Right.
But it was interesting how everything came into being at that area.
So Scheib spent a total of $67,500, which is a little less than $2 million today, on 7 land packages totaling 5 3/4 acres. And in February 1908, he arranged, like you mentioned, to have those 2 proposed streets running through the block dropped from the city plan. So once he had all the land, he hired William Steele and Sons to design and build the park. So the construction of that stadium was pretty revolutionary. What made it so different from other ballparks that existed at the time?
It was the first ballpark that was built of reinforced concrete and steel, because all the ballparks at the time were wooden. You were at the mercy of fire all the time. Fans smoked in a ballpark at the time. Cigars, cigarettes. Somebody drops, a cigar through a slat in the bleachers in the floor. It falls underneath, catches some trash on fire, and that's how the Polo Grounds fire happened in 1911. There was a fire at the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia. Many Sportsman's Park, many parks suffered the same fate. So William Steele and Sons specialized in steel and reinforced concrete. They actually built the first skyscraper in Philadelphia, which was the Witherspoon Building. They were experts in that field, in design and construction. And the ballpark was unique in that it was basically the first modern ballpark, in the fact that it had modern amenities for the players. The locker rooms, the dressing rooms, had a direct tunnel were underneath the grandstand, and they had a tunnel that led them directly into the dugouts.
So you didn't have to walk through the crowds.
You didn't have to walk through the crowds.
Yeah.
You didn't have to walk into center field like you did at the Polo Grounds. So the players can go directly from the dugout into a tunnel and into the locker room.
Yeah.
They had indoor parking underneath the bleachers along Lehigh Avenue, which was where a lot of the players parked their cars. And some fans who, if they came via horse-drawn carriage or a car, they had access to parking there. But the players who drove, who didn't take public transportation at the time, streetcars or trolley cars, they could park their cars there. They had a restaurant. They had a team store. They had a press dining room. They had a press box for all the scribes.
Yeah.
It basically had all the modern amenities. It was the first truly modern Major League Baseball park.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so it was completed in time for opening day of 1909, which was held on April 12th against the Boston Red Sox. Shibe Park was 515 feet to dead center. That's kind of hard to fathom.
Yes.
But the first game was kind of crazy and bordered on the edge of chaos for the city. What do you know about that day?
Like the game in 1907, on September 3rd, 1907, everybody who was a baseball fan in Philadelphia wanted to be there, and everybody descended on that site. The gates opened at noon for a 3 o'clock game, and by the time it was 1 o'clock, the ballpark was already filled up 2 hours before first pitch. They had festivities. They had the 1st and 3rd Regiment bands were playing. Fans were there to watch batting practice. There was well over 25,000, probably 30,000 people inside of the ballpark. People were sitting on top of the outfield wall, on the scoreboard. All the rooftops along Somerset Street in left field and 20th Street in right field were packed. Fans were roped off in the outfield. And there were still thousands of fans that were left out in the cold that couldn't get in. So based on all the estimates, they could have sold 50,000 seats that day, which is amazing because the following day, April 13th, also against the Red Sox, there was less than 3,000 people at that game.
Right. Well, that's not opening day anymore.
Right.
It's
not opening
day.
day. And the novelty wore off after one game, I guess. But the first game, they could have easily sold close to 50,000 tickets probably. Yeah. But there was a lot of pomp and circumstance. It was covered in all the national papers. All the big cities covered it because it was the first ballpark of its kind.
Yeah.
Later on that season, Pittsburgh would open up theirs, and then League Park in Cleveland soon thereafter. And then, obviously, when the Polo Grounds was rebuilt. So they started a boom in ballpark construction.
Yeah. 2 weeks later, Doc Powers was dead.
Yes.
We mentioned him earlier. He was the personal catcher of Eddie Plank, who was one of the greatest left-handed pitchers in the history of baseball. Doc was also one of Connie Mack's favorite players. What can you tell us about Doc Powers and what happened? How did he die?
Doc was an original member of Connie Mack's Athletics. He was there on opening day 1901, and Connie loved him like a son. He was college educated. He went to Holy Cross College in Massachusetts. He was a physician. He was a practicing physician. He had his medical license. He practiced medicine in the off season. And he was like a son to Connie. He was a very well-respected catcher. He was loved universally, not only by his teammates, but every other player in the American League. And by 1909, Doc was at the end of his career. His arm strength wasn't what it used to be. He wasn't hitting as much. He was never a good hitter, but he was a good defensive catcher and a great game caller, and Eddie Plank's personal catcher. Mm-hmm. But he wanted to be there for opening day at Shibe Park, and he was in a lineup. Somewhere around the 7th inning, he felt a sharp pain in his side, in his abdomen. But he didn't say anything to anybody. He just kept playing. He went to bat in the 8th inning, reached on an error, scored a run. After the game, he collapsed in the clubhouse. They took him to Northwest General Hospital up towards Chestnut Hill in the northwestern section of the city. Nobody knew what happened at the time. I mean, there was rumors that he had a cheese sandwich before the game and maybe the sandwich was spoiled or whatnot. Another rumor was that he was chasing after a foul ball and he ran into the brick wall behind home plate and kind of punctured something in his abdomen.
It almost sounds like it could have been even appendicitis.
Yeah, they called it intussusception of his intestine. It was a telescoping of his large intestine into his small intestine.
Wow.
They had to perform surgery. They took out about 15 inches of his intestine. When they opened him up, they found gangrene in there. So he had been probably suffering for a while. But during this game, the pain got so severe, and then after the game, he collapsed. Mm-hmm. So they performed a couple of surgeries on him. And then on April 25th, which was 13 days, almost 2 weeks after the first game,
right,
it was obvious to all of his physicians that he was not going to survive, that death was near. He was a Roman Catholic. They called in a priest to administer last rites. His wife was there, and he died early the next morning. And the Athletics were going to be playing in Washington against the Senators. And on the day of his funeral, both teams postponed the game and attended Doc's funeral. Mm-hmm. 6 of his teammates were pallbearers: Danny Murphy, Eddie Plank, I believe, Simon Nichols, who actually had the first hit for the Athletics the first game at Shibe Park, and 3 other players. And it's ironic because Simon Nichols, who was the shortstop that day, himself died 2 years later from typhoid fever. So it was hard for them to recover. Max said it was tough. It was tough on him personally. Doc was like a son to him. They wore a black ribbon on their chest covering the A. It was a black ribbon for 30 days after he died. It was a tragic event. It definitely marred the festivities of the opening of Shibe Park, for sure.
I was wondering, do you think that losing him changed Connie Mack? Like, why should I get close to another player and just wind up possibly getting crushed again one day? So after that point, he started looking at players as more like commodities as opposed to human beings. Do you think there's a correlation there?
It's very possible. I've read his biography. It's hard to say, what was going through his mind, but it's possible because after that, he treated his players more like pieces to his business instead of family members, instead of like sons. Like I said, he and Doc were very close, and he never really was that close to any other player the rest of his career there, and he still managed another 41 years, 1909. So he never really got close to anybody like that again.
Yeah. So the Athletics had won the pennant in 1902 and 1905, and as great as the 1909 season was in their new ballpark, the team really came into their own in 1910 and took the dynasty to new heights, thanks in large part to the $100,000 infield. That consisted of first baseman Stuffy McInnes, second baseman Eddie Collins, shortstop Jack Barry, and third baseman Frank Home Run Baker. What can you tell us about that group?
That group basically came together that year. They gelled as a team. They had a streak in May where they won 13 out of 14 games. They went on a run.
Mm-hmm.
In June 30th of 1910, Connie Mack had Doc Powers Day. It was basically a charity day to raise money for Doc's widow and his children, his daughters. The team really came together then. Everybody showed up. A lot of other American League players showed up because there was almost every other team was off that day. So a lot of other American League players showed up. There was an exhibition with some of the American League stars playing against the Athletics, field events. According to Mack, the team really gelled during that day. They raised over $8,000 for Doc's widow. But the key was the infield, because when Eddie Collins first came up, Connie knew that he had a good hitter and a fast base runner. I mean, he could make it from the left-handed batter's box to first in 3.4 seconds, which is pretty darn fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he was not a great defender, so Mack didn't know what he had in him. So he tried him everywhere. He tried him at third, he tried him at short, he tried him at second. He even tried him in the outfield. Mm-hmm. Eddie Collins was a butcher in the outfield. There was one day he was going after a foul ball, just crossing into foul territory. His sunglasses fell over his eyes, fell down his face, distracted him, and he dropped the ball and almost plowed into the brick wall that was in front of the right field bleachers. So Connie knew outfield was out of the question. Mm-hmm. So now he just had to find a place for him somewhere in the infield. When Jack Barry came, they tried a number of different combinations. Simon Nichols was still there. And eventually one day in 1908, it was the second game of a doubleheader. He placed Barry at short, he placed Eddie at second. And the rest is history. Mm-hmm. That was his keystone combination for a number of years. And Baker, who had a really good year in 1909, kind of fell off in 1910 offensively. His power numbers kind of dipped down. But he was still very formidable at the plate and on defense. Mm-hmm. And Harry Davis was their aging first baseman in 1910. And he was also with Connie Mack since 1901. He was actually retired when Connie came calling. Mm-hmm. Harry Davis played in the National League in the 1800s. He played for the Louisville Colonels, among other teams. And he was retired. He was going to be a coach. And Connie talked him into coming out of retirement and playing. And that was 1901. And here we are in 1910, and Harry Davis is still a starting first baseman.
But also basically a coach on the field.
A coach on the field. Harry was basically the captain.
And would perform the on-field duties.
All the on-field duties. He would take out the lineup cards before the game. He would make the pitching changes because Connie, everybody knows that he managed in his suit and the hat. Connie never went onto the field during a game. So one of his coaches or one of his captains would do all the on-field duties. And at the time it was Harry Davis. And even though Harry was an older player and he was near the end of his career, he was still one of the best fielding first basemen in baseball. And Stuffy McInnis was already on the team. And he was not yet the team's first baseman. He primarily played shortstop at the time. Mm-hmm. Jack Barry was injured for a portion early in the season, and Stuffy McInnis filled in at shortstop, which was his natural position, playing amateur ball in Massachusetts. He played with Haverhill in Massachusetts in the New England League, and he played shortstop up there. So things started to gel. The outfield gelled. He had a nice little three-headed monster behind the plate with Ira Thomas, Jack Lapp, and Patty Livingston. Mm-hmm. None of them were great hitters, but they were all good defensive catchers. Mm-hmm. I mean, Patty Livingston threw out 50% of the base runners, which he had a cannon for an arm. Yeah. So he had some pretty good talent on that team. Yeah. The key was the starting rotation. I mean, that starting rotation, 1910, you had Eddie Plank, Chief Bender, Cy Morgan, and Jack Combs. Just all had stellar seasons and all pretty much had career years. Mm-hmm. Jack Combs threw 13 shutouts that year. And that to this day is still the American League record.
Which will never be touched.
Never be touched. As long as they play the game the way they play today with the pitching changes and stuff. And guys threw well over 100 pitches back then and well over 300 innings. Yeah. 13 shutouts will never be matched. But they gelled and they took off and they won the American League pennant handily. And they met the Chicago Cubs in the World Series. And the Chicago Cubs were the mighty Chicago Cubs. I mean, they were the 20th century's first dynasty. Right. 1910 was their fourth pennant in 6 years. They had won in 06, 07, 08, and 1910. So their fourth pennant in 5 years. Right. And most of the writers of the day, most experts picked the Cubs to win handily. Mm-hmm. Ty Cobb actually picked the Athletics because he knew, having played against them for the last 2 years, he picked the Athletics to win. So the World Series started in Philadelphia on October 17th. The Athletics won the game, and they won the second game. And they ended up winning the World Series in 5 games. But the most fascinating part is that today's fan would find it hard to believe. The entire World Series, all 5 games, Connie Mack used just 2 pitchers.
Right. I was going to ask you about this.
Just 2 pitchers pitched every single inning. Jack Combs and Chief Bender pitched every inning of every game of that 5-game World Series.
Yeah. Now the record for most pitchers used in one game is 9.
Right. It's
And they used 2 pitchers for an entire series and won.
It's insane.
Yeah.
And it wasn't by design, it was by necessity. Because Morgan and Plank were both injured. They had different injuries. Morgan had a hamstring injury, I believe, and Plank had an arm injury. So 2 of his 4 starting pitchers were injured. But he decided to make do. Bender pitched phenomenal ball. Combs was a little more wild, as he always was. He did have a propensity to walk a lot of base runners and have runners on base, but he had that great fastball where he could come back and strike guys out. So yeah, they used just 2 pitchers the entire World Series, and that World Series ended one dynasty and launched another.
Right.
So it was the end of the National League's first dynasty of the 20th century and launched the American League's first dynasty of the 20th century, because from there the Athletics really took off.
Right. So they won the World Series in 1910. Then they won it again in 1911 and 1913. But despite having the best team in baseball, Connie Mack still looked for every competitive advantage that he could possibly find. For instance, in the 1913 World Series, he ordered the groundskeeper at Shibe Park to water down the dirt around first base to make it harder for the notoriously fast New York Giants to steal bases. Where do you think that competitive drive came from?
He was always a competitive guy. He was a major league catcher for a number of years with Pittsburgh and Buffalo. And he played in an era in the 1800s. Guys took every advantage that they could find to beat the competition. Whether it was legal, whether it was illegal, there was really not much in the rule book back then to say you can't do this, you can't do that.
Right.
And he knew that McGraw valued speed and base running and played small ball. And he also had 2 strong-armed catchers in that World Series, Jack Lappin and Ira Thomas. And they slowed the Giants down.
Yeah.
They didn't steal as many bases, and Lappin and Thomas ended up throwing out quite a few base runners that series. So
Yeah. So you made a sweater based on the ones that the Athletics wore between 1909 and 1912. What gave you this idea, and why aren't those things still a thing in modern baseball? Because I feel like they would sell so well, especially in today's day and age where retro jerseys and throwback uniforms, like, wouldn't every single person buy a sweater like this?
That's a good question. When I posted this sweater on Twitter when I first made it, people were writing me left and right, where can I get one of those out?
Right.
Take my money now. I was like, sorry, this is the only one in existence.
Right.
Being a fan of the team and of that era, that famous photo of Chief Bender in 1909 at Shibe Park with that sweater, I just decided, you know what, I needed one of those for myself. Here in Philadelphia, we have it's a nostalgia store called Mitchell & Ness. It's a sporting goods nostalgia store.
Yes.
And Peter Capolino used to run the store, and he used to make those sweaters. And Mitchell & Ness used to sell those sweaters back in the early 90s. You could buy a Philadelphia Phillies one with the red with the white P. You can buy a New York Giants one.
But they were all
Athletics.
like hand-stitched and were like literally like $500,
They
right?
were $500,
Yeah.
but they were phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
But at the time, I was just out of college. I wasn't making any money. And I was like, I cannot pay $500 for a sweater.
Right.
I just couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And years passed by, and I just totally forgot about them. And then a few years back, I saw that photo of Bender again, and I was like, you know what? I need that sweater. But I couldn't find one anymore. And the sweater that Peter made at Mitchell & Ness was the sweater that they wore in 1913, 1914. It was the double elephant that was standing up. I wanted the single elephant, the original one. So I was like, you know what? I'll make one myself. I just Googled navy blue cardigan sweaters. I picked one out, came in the mail, navy blue sweater with brown buttons. So I told my wife about what I'm going to do. She's like, okay, all right, let's see what you're going to do. So I went to Walmart, actually. I got some premium white felt. I actually sat down and I looked at the Bender's sweater there, and I drew the exact same template in pencil on a piece of cardboard.
Like the elephant silhouette?
The elephant silhouette.
Yeah.
I cut it out to use it as a template, and I traced it over the white felt. I cut it out. It looked exactly like it did on Bender's sweater, and I ended up buying some white buttons, and I was like, all right, now what am I going to do? Because I can't sew.
I've got all the pieces.
I got all the pieces, but I can't sew.
Yeah.
So it dawned on me, the dry cleaner I use in my town that I live in, he has a couple of seamstresses back there, and they do phenomenal work. their attention to detail is spot on.
Yeah.
So I took the sweater there with the design and in these buttons and stuff. And I tried to explain to him what I was looking for. And he's looking at me like I have two heads. And I was like, could you do that for me? He's like, yeah. Okay, well, we can try. He goes, there's no guarantee, but I'll give it a try. I was like, that's all I'm asking for. Just give it a shot. So 2 weeks later, he gives me a call saying it's ready. So I went in there. I didn't know what to expect. And he hung it on the rack and in the plastic. I took it out and I was like, wow, great job. So
yeah, it's perfect.
It was, it turned out pretty well. I break it out for special occasions. So I don't know how long it's going to last me, but hopefully I'll be able to pass it on to my son someday. But
yeah.
I'm positive if somebody can get the licensing from Major League Baseball and has the wherewithal to produce these, not mass produce them, but produce them in small quantities, there is a small fortune to be made.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
Because there is definitely a market for it. If not just Major League, but like there's tons of amateur teams still, adult leagues, men's leagues. I have some guys that play in men's leagues outside of Philadelphia here that say, oh, we would love like a bunch of these for our men's league and stuff because we play some of our games in April and early May.
Or in September and October.
Yeah. But some of the major league ones, like I'm sure if somebody came up with a Red Sox or Yankees cardigan sweater, I'm sure that would be
absolutely.
Like,
I would buy the hell out of a White Sox one.
Like a White Sox one, like the one Eddie Collins or Joe Jackson would wear in 1917.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We all know that Joe Jackson eventually played for the White Sox, but that wasn't the first time that a former Athletic ended up as property of Charles Comiskey. Eddie Collins won the MVP award as the second baseman of the Athletics in 1914. He batted .344 with a Major League leading 122 runs. He also walked 97 times, stole 58 bases, drove in 85 runs for a team that had just won the pennant. It was their fourth pennant in 5 years, and like we said, they had won 3 World Series. So it was kind of controversial that Connie Mack sold Eddie Collins to Charles Comiskey on December 8th, 1914. What do you know about that? Why did that happen?
Well, Connie was basically disenfranchised with his team in 1914. A lot of the players were getting offers from the Federal League. They were offering them a lot more money to jump to the Federal League, offering contracts to Chief Bender, to Eddie Plank. I believe Eddie Collins was offered more money.
But were any of them going, or they were just receiving the offers?
They were receiving offers. They were thinking about it. I mean, a lot of guys were, because the Athletics were a great team, but they were not the highest paid players in the league. So the players were doing their due diligence and finding out how much they could make there. And, if they could break out of their reserve clause contract, because that was sticky on the legal front. And then the 1914 World Series rolls around, and they're playing the Boston Braves. And the Boston Braves on July 4th were in last place in the National League. They had been bottom feeders for years, since the beginning of the 20th century. And then just out of the blue, they just shot up and went from last place to winning the National League pennant by 10 games, I believe it was. But nobody gave them a chance against the Athletics, because this team had just won its 5th pennant and was looking for their 4th title since 1910. And they got their butts handed to them in Game 1 by the Braves. I believe they lost 7-1. And they ended up getting swept, obviously, so it was anticlimactic. But there was rumors that some of the players were either paid off or were thinking about jumping to the Federal League, and they just didn't care anymore. They just laid down. Another rumor has it that Danny Murphy, a former star, second baseman and right fielder for the Athletics, who left the Athletics after the 1913 World Series and went to Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Tip-Tops of the Federal League. Danny Murphy had designs on being the Athletics manager in 1914. He thought that Connie was too old and he should be on his way out, so he wanted to take over as manager. Mack had obviously no intentions of leaving anytime soon.
And he wouldn't for 36 years.
Right. And Murphy was near the end as a player, so he jumped over to the Federal League for the 1914 season. And he was friendly with many players in both leagues. A rumor has it that he was coaching some of the Boston Braves players and giving them tips on the athletic signs and what they do in certain situations. He basically gave them an advanced scouting report.
Interesting.
So that's another rumor. So like with some of the other stuff, Rube Waddell with the 1905, I don't think we'll ever know.
Right.
So Connie realized that it was time to rebuild. A lot of the players were getting older. He had won his 3 world championships and 5 pennants, and he decided it was time to rebuild. And Comiskey was looking for a drawing card, a big name, and a captain for his team.
Because he was looking to build a dynasty of his own.
Correct. So in December of 1914, Comiskey quietly took the train into Philadelphia, and he met right across the street from where we are right now at the Hotel Bellevue. It was a clandestine meeting with Connie Mack on a Sunday night, and nobody knew about it at the time. They even had somebody else sign the register at the front desk, because obviously people knew Connie Mack, and many people knew Charlie Comiskey, everybody being baseball fans back then.
Was Eddie Collins there, or just...
From what I understand, Collins was there.
Whoa.
So Mack and Collins agreed to part ways, and Collins agreed to go to the White Sox.
Wow.
So Comiskey had his star, and he had his captain. And Mack decided it was time to start to break things up.
Yeah. And break things up, did he?
Did he? Now, Frank Baker was still under contract for the 1915 season, but he wanted a raise. And Connie was a tough negotiator. For those who are familiar with Shibe Park, the cupola behind center field, the top of the cupola was where Connie Mack's office was. And there was a bridge that led from the concourse to the cupola to his office. And the players called that bridge the Bridge of Tears, because every time they would go into his office to ask for more money, they would get rebuffed, and they would leave there with their tail between their legs crying because they would not get their wish.
This quote from Connie Mack in 1918, "No ball player who ever lived is worth more than $5,000 for a season's work. There is no other work in the world where a man receives greater compensation for less effort than he does in baseball."
Right.
So if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about where Connie Mack was coming from in his negotiation process.
Right. Baker actually was the preeminent slugger.
He was named Home Run Baker.
Right.
Well, how did he get that nickname? Let's talk about him.
Well, he got that nickname in the 1911 World Series. The Athletics were playing the Giants in the 1911 World Series. They were tied at 1 game apiece. He hit dramatic game-tying and go-ahead home runs in games 3 and 4 off of 2 Hall of Famers, Rube Marquardt and Christy Mathewson. One at the Polo Grounds and one at Shibe Park. At the time, hitting home runs like that over the fence against Hall of Fame pitching was rare.
Yeah.
He did it in back-to-back games. He batted over 400 that World Series with the 2 home runs, scored, I believe, 7 runs. So he just earned that nickname, that moniker, Home Run Baker, and it stuck with him the rest of his career. Even though his teammates called him Frank, the fans, the media, all called him Home Run Baker. But he not only hit home runs, which he hit 96 for his career, but at the time...
Which was a lot back then.
At the time, that was a lot.
Yeah.
But he hit a lot of doubles and triples as well.
He led the majors in triples one year.
Yep. His best year was 1912, by far. And that's the year, actually, in that stretch that they did not win a pennant. They fell short that year. But this is a little-known fact. He's one of 4 players in Major League history to win 4 consecutive home run titles.
Whoa.
And 2 of them were Athletics. So 4 players led their league in home runs 4 years in a row or more. One of them is easy because he's the greatest of all time, Babe Ruth.
Right.
Frank Baker, Harry Davis,
oh, wow,
and Ralph Kiner. Those are the only 4 guys that led their league in home runs 4 years in a row or more.
That's incredible.
And Baker was, at the time, the preeminent offensive performer and slugger in baseball, and in the American League especially. So he decided he wanted more money, and Mack said no. So Baker held out. He was a farm boy from Maryland's Eastern Shore, a small town called Trapp down in eastern Maryland. And he's like, all right, you're not going to give me what I want. I'm going down to my farm, and when you're ready, you can call me.
And the phone didn't ring.
The phone didn't ring. Mack's phone didn't ring. Baker's phone didn't ring.
Yeah.
These were 2 men of principle and stubborn as oxes, and neither one budged. So Baker sat out that entire season, played for a local semi-pro team in Maryland to try to stay sharp. But obviously, you're not going to stay as sharp playing semi-pro baseball in Maryland that you would facing Major League pitching.
Right.
So he held out, and the holdout was going to continue into the 1916 season. And finally, Ben Johnson had had enough. He basically called Connie Mack and said, "What are you doing? This is one of the top players in the league, one of the best drawing cards." And so Ben Johnson basically forced Mack's hand, and he facilitated a trade to the Yankees. So Baker was traded for the 1916 season. He was productive. He was productive the rest of his career. He played through 1922. He actually played with Babe Ruth, but he was never the same player after that.
Right.
That layoff hurt him.
Absolutely.
Even though he worked on his farm and he stayed in shape by duck hunting and farming and playing amateur baseball, it just wasn't the same. He was never the same player after that.
Yeah.
Like I said, he did play with Babe Ruth. He was Babe's teammate for 3 seasons. And even though they were friendly, Baker was not a fan of the lively ball.
Right.
He figured it just
He thought they were cheap home runs.
They were cheap home runs, and Cobb was the same way, and a lot of guys who were top players in the dead ball didn't like the new game of baseball in 1920 and beyond. So it took them a while to get used to it. Eventually they warmed up to it, but Baker did not care for that style of ball. But that year he held out really hurt him, because who knows how great he could have been, whether it was with the Athletics or with somebody else. But yeah, they fell off the table in 1915.
Right, and the 1916 team is legitimately one of the worst teams in the history of baseball. And this type of dismantling of a championship-winning team would happen again before Mac's career was over. Mm-hmm. Just how bad were the 1916 Athletics?
The 1916 Athletics have the worst winning percentage over a full season since 1900.
Yeah.
The Cleveland Spiders of 1899 have the worst, but that team finished a season under extenuating circumstances. Mm-hmm. But in the modern era, quote unquote, since 1900, people think of the 62 Mets or the 2003 Tigers, who lost 119 games. But the 1916 Athletics have the worst winning percentage since 1900. They were horrible. They were a horrible team. Attendance was dead last. People didn't show up. They had basically no talent. Connie was just pulling guys off of sandlots.
Which is shocking for a team that was just coming off of the best stretch in the history of the sport.
In the history of the sport to that time.
2 years earlier.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy how quickly things turned.
Yep. And it was a slow rebuild. Connie had there's a method to his madness. Mm-hmm. There were some lean years there through World War I and into the 1920s. Mm-hmm. But slowly things started to turn around.
The second dynasty really began in 1927, featuring Al Simmons, Jimmy Fox, and Mickey Cochran in the heart of the lineup. They finished second to the Yankees in 1927 and 28, but then they won the AL pennant in 29, 30, and 31, winning 100 or more games in each of those years. How do you think Connie Mack was able to assemble two such dominant teams in his career? Was he that good, or were his scouts better than everyone else, or was there just not as much competition back then?
Connie had a great team of scouts. He really did. And they didn't travel all over the country. He pretty much had a pipeline from New England, Eastern Maryland, South Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania. He basically scouted players in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. Home Run Baker, Jimmy Fox, Lefty Grove, three of the best of all time. Yeah. All came from Maryland's Eastern Shore. Mm-hmm. A lot of the guys from this Deadball dynasty came from New England. Stuffy McInnes came from New England. Jack Barry came from New England. Mm-hmm. He was from there as well, so he was familiar with the type of talent that was up there.
Yeah.
And a lot of his former players were loyal to him.
Yes.
And would come back and say, you know what, I have a tip on this guy. And you would think that Frank Baker would be bitter towards Connie Mack, the way things ended in Philadelphia for Baker. But Baker was managing a team in Easton, Maryland in 1925. And he had a young boy, the 17-year-old high school kid by the name of Jimmy Fox on that team. So Baker in 1925 brought Fox with him to Philadelphia. And the Yankees were in town. They were managed by Miller Huggins at the time. Mm-hmm. And Baker brought him in town because he wanted to sell Fox to one of the two teams that he played for.
Right.
And he knew that he would get a lot of money for Jimmy. So he offered them to the Yankees first. They declined. They already had Gehrig and Ruth. You probably heard of those guys. And Connie jumped on him and said, yeah, I'll sign him. He signed him as a 17-year-old catcher, believe it or not. And the rest, as I say, is history, because he would go down as one of the greatest power hitters of all time.
But how different could baseball have been if he had signed with the Yankees?
Exactly. I mean, you would have had Jimmy Fox, Lou Gehrig, and Babe Ruth in the middle of a lineup.
For a decade.
It would have been insane.
Right. That's 1,700 home runs.
Yep. Yeah. It's crazy. But thankfully, Miller Huggins said, we don't need him. Yeah. Connie said, I'll take him. And thankfully, the Athletics got him, and he ended up pairing up with Al Simmons and Mickey Cochran and Jimmy Dykes and Bing Miller. But going back to earlier in our conversation about Connie really valuing guys with high on base percentages, both of his dynasties were started with guys who got on base at a 400 or more clip.
Yeah, so Max Bishop, nicknamed Camera Eye.
Camera Eye, for a reason, for a very good reason.
He was the leadoff hitter of the 1929 team specifically, which you think is the greatest team in the history of baseball.
Yes.
Why?
That team did everything well. They pitched, they hit with power, they played great team defense. They just did everything well. It just seemed easy for them. And to be honest with you, the 1930 team might have been even better. All three of those teams were incredible, but they did everything well. Fundamentals, pure talent, power, hitting for average. They didn't strike out. They did everything well. And they had a great pitching staff, headed by Lefty Grove, one of the top three left-handers of all time.
Yeah.
They just did everything well. And the funny thing is, people think of the Yankees, the Bronx Bombers, but that dynasty was a 7th game away from being the first team in World Series history to win 3 consecutive World Series titles.
Right.
Even the Yankees, up until that time, had not won 3 in a row.
Right.
But 1931, they were a great team. They were just done in by Pepper Martin in the World Series. He was a one-man wrecking crew. When you're talking about the greatest teams of all time, especially before integration, it always comes down to the 29 A's and the 27 Yankees.
Right.
Going back to Max Bishop, in his first dynasty, he had Topsy Hartzell, who was also an on-base machine, who led the league in walks numerous times and was an on-base guy. That's what Connie did. He had guys at the top of the order who would get on base via walk or hit. The second guy was able to hit behind the runner, move them along. And then you had the power hitters down lower, Eddie Collins and Frank Baker with his first dynasty. And then you had Jimmy Fox and Al Simmons and Bing Miller. So
it's crazy that he was having these thoughts in the early 1900s, and then for 100 years, teams forgot about that concept. And now it's back to analytics, and they're rediscovering something that Connie Mack thought of 120 years ago. That if the first guy that hits in our lineup gets on base more times than not, we're probably going to do all right. How was he so far ahead of his time, and how did nobody else catch up?
It's hard to explain. Connie was just a very analytical mind. He was always a thinker. He was always thinking of what could we do better? What could we do that no other team does? And even back then, guys didn't strike out a lot. There weren't a lot of strikeouts back then like there are today. You'll have a game like the Braves-Reds playoff game.
Right.
There was 38 strikeouts
Right, something like that.
in the game.
Yeah.
Guys just didn't strike out back then. And it wasn't just the leadoff guys. Most of his guys had high on-base percentages, like we talked. Mickey Cochran had a career 400 on-base percentage.
Yeah.
Jimmy Dykes and Jimmy Fox and Max Bishop. Ferris Fain, who played for him later on, is one of the top 10 in on-base percentage in Major League history. He just had a way of finding those guys who had a good eye at the plate. And if they're not going to give me anything to hit, I'll take my walk and have the next guy bring me home.
Absolutely. Connie Mack called the comeback win in Game 4 of the 1929 World Series, quote, "the greatest thrill I've had in 29 years of managing." Obviously, he had 21 more years after that, but at that point. What can you tell us about that game against the Cubs at Shibe Park? It was October 12th, 1929.
Right. Well, the Athletics and the Cubs were, embroiled in a tight series. The Cubs went out to an 8-0 lead. Obviously, you don't blow 8-0 leads.
In the bottom of the 7th.
In the bottom of the 7th.
It wasn't 8-0 in the top of the 3rd.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was in the bottom of the 7th inning. Yeah. And if the Cubs win that game, it's a whole new series.
Yeah.
It basically boils down to a best of 3 after that.
Right.
And the Athletics ended up scoring 10 runs in the bottom of the 7th inning, helped out by the defensive shortcomings of one Hack Wilson, who lost the ball in the sun on a cloudy day. But yeah, it was an incredible comeback. They scored 10 runs in the bottom of the 7th inning when all hope had seemed to be lost that day. And it propelled them to that championship. And Connie said that was his greatest thrill in baseball up to that time.
Yeah. A really interesting story that I think gives a lot of insight as to who Connie Mack was capable of being, not only as a manager but as a person, is the story of Howard Emke and Game 1 of the 1929 World Series. Tell us what happened there.
Emke was a side-arming junk baller who had been pitching in the major leagues for quite some time. I mean, he pitched for Buffalo in the Federal League in 1915. So he was a grizzled veteran, to say the least. And he was a sidewinder through junk. His ball could probably not break a pane of glass. But the Cubs were a fierce fastball hitting team with Hack Wilson and Riggs Stevenson and Kai Kyler. And Mack knew that if he would put Lefty Grove in there, they had a chance to tee off on him because they just feasted on the fastball. He decided that he would put Emke in there to keep them off balance. He was kind of like a right-handed version of Jamie Moyer, if you remember Jamie Moyer.
Absolutely.
And he did. He shut the Cubs down, held them in check, struck out a then World Series record 13 batters.
Right.
And basically set the tone for the World Series.
But it was more than that. Emke had a dead arm at the end of that season, and he took the last month of that season off.
Yes.
And Connie Mack said, "You go scout the Cubs this month because we're probably going to end up playing them in the World Series." Yep. And so not only was he the Game 1 starter, it was his first start in weeks.
Right.
After having traveled around the country watching the Cubs play and learning what are their weaknesses.
And Emke was actually, when he was hurt, he wasn't exactly hanging around at the ballpark. He was a business owner. He founded and ran a company in Philadelphia that still exists to this day called the Emke Manufacturing Company.
Right.
And he manufactured tarpaulins
Right.
that were used to cover diamonds in baseball. And actually, Connie Mack was his first customer.
He was the guy who invented the tarp.
The tarp.
That covers the infield.
Exactly.
And the company also sold them to football fields
Yep.
and to cover military equipment.
Yep. And the company still to this day makes equipment for the military. The military is their biggest customer. And they make awnings, tarps, all kinds of coverings. And the Department of Defense is their biggest customer. And that company is still around and doing quite well to this day.
Yeah.
So he was busy running his business when Connie sent him out to scout the Cubs. And, that's what happens when you have good advanced scouting.
Yeah, absolutely. The 1931 team, like we talked about, they were a Game 7 loss away from being the first team in baseball history to win 3 straight World Series. They went 107-45 for a 704 win percentage that year, including an incredible 60-15 at home. They scored 5.6 runs per game. They had 5 Hall of Famers on their team. Why are those 3 teams, the 1929, 30, and 31 Athletics, so largely forgotten in the discussion of the greatest teams in baseball history?
Probably because they didn't have a guy by the name of Babe Ruth on that team and Lou Gehrig. And it wasn't in New York. It was Philadelphia. Philadelphia was always second fiddle to New York. Always. And to this day, Philadelphians still feel like New York looks down upon them. Like there's a certain inferiority. It was a smaller city. They didn't have the huge superstar with the supersized egos, like Ruth, for example. But the casual fan really doesn't know how great that team was.
Right.
You need to be a pretty hardcore fan or historian to know how great that team was. Like you mentioned, they were loaded with Hall of Fame talent. I mean, we're talking some of the greatest players of all time. People don't realize how great Al Simmons was.
Right.
Go back and look at his numbers. The hits and the runs and the run production.
Yeah.
He was just an incredible player with the ugliest swing. I mean, his nickname was Bucketfoot for a reason. But he produced.
Yeah.
They just didn't have those larger-than-life figures, I guess you can say, which they didn't stand out like the Babe Ruth did, and even like Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb, for example.
Yeah.
But they were much like the manager themselves. Both of his dynasties, they were molded in his image,
Yeah.
and Connie didn't draw attention to himself, and neither did his players for the most part.
Yeah.
Most of the guys were not outspoken. His most outspoken player was Rube Waddell, and he had been gone for 25 years.
Right. In the early 1930s, the Philadelphia Athletics were the team in baseball, and they frequently sold out games. The thing is that more people wanted to watch, and nearby buildings began selling tickets to their own rooftop bleachers. Connie Mack was not pleased with this. This was a man who sold most of his players in order to avoid paying too much money to them during the Great Depression. So when it came to money, Mack was not someone to mess with, like you mentioned, the Bridge of Tears. He had sold Muehlhaus, Jimmy Dykes, and Al Simmons to the White Sox on September 28, 1932 for a reported $150,000. Instead of negotiating with the building owners, he sued them in 1933, and Mack lost that suit, but he was determined to win the war, so he heightened the fence to 33 feet so the nearby buildings were unable to see the games. But that decision backfired because the neighborhood felt cut off, and they abandoned the team. And this was really the beginning of the end for the Athletics in Philadelphia. Jimmy Foxx won the AL MVP and a Triple Crown in 1933, so he went in to Connie Mack's office and asked for a raise before the 1934 season. Mack counteroffered with $5,000 less than he had made in 1933. It's always been my contention that the Philadelphia Athletics were the Florida Marlins before the Florida Marlins were the Florida Marlins.
Right.
On 2 separate occasions, Connie Mack completely dismantled championship teams who weren't out of their championship window just to save the team from having to pay more money to their players.
Right. The second dynasty probably had more in them than the first dynasty did because a lot of the players, Jimmy Foxx was in his prime.
Right.
Because 1929, he was not in his prime yet.
Right.
So Jimmy Foxx was in his prime.
He just won the Triple Crown.
Right. Lefty Grove was still in his prime. Bing Miller was older, but Muehlhaus and Jimmy Dykes were still very good players. And he was really hurt by the Depression. The Philadelphia Athletics were never a really deep-pocketed team. They didn't have that brewery money like the Yankees did. And the Depression hurt.
There was a quote from Connie Mack on October 4th, 1932. "We played to empty parks most of last season. You can't imagine how deep in the red we are involved. Our attendance fell off 40%. So he knew you needed to kind of play the game in the media to get the sympathy and
Right.
make people think like, oh, okay, he's doing this for specific reasons. But everybody was hurting.
Right. Like I said, they were losing money with the loss in attendance and revenue. That was number one. Number two, most teams were making up for that by selling advertising space inside of the ballpark.
Right.
If you look at photos of all the old parks back then, there was ads everywhere.
Everywhere.
And that brings in revenue. Shibe Park did not have any ads. Connie Mack did not believe that. On the outfield walls, he had a couple of signs about not throwing projectiles onto the field, not throwing seat cushions onto the field, but there's no advertising inside of the ballpark.
And no beer sales.
And no beer sales. And he stood firm on those two principles, knowing full well that he could make a lot more money. And the fans weren't showing up because it was the Great Depression. People were counting every penny they possibly could. So Somerset Street behind left field had been cut off since 1925 because they double-decked the pavilion there. But on 20th Street in right field, fans still sat on the rooftops. And it was actually John Scheib's idea, Ben Scheib's son, to raise the height of the wall.
Which they called the spite fence.
The spite fence.
Yeah.
And they call it Connie Mack's spite fence. But the fence was actually not Connie Mack's idea. It was Scheib's idea.
Interesting.
But anyway, so they built the fence. They raised the height of the wall, like you had mentioned. And that truly was the beginning of the end, because all the goodwill that had been built up since 1901 between the neighborhood and the team was pretty much gone after that.
And they were not putting a winning team on the field anymore.
Right.
So you lose the confidence and the faith of your fans.
Right.
And you don't give them something to come cheer for. So, okay, well, then we're just not going to show up anymore.
Right. So he was basically tired of the neighborhood boy standing on the street corner saying, you know what, instead of paying 50 cents at Shibe Park, come watch the game for 25 cents on our rooftop. So they were tired of that. They put an end to it.
Yeah.
But what really did them in was the fight over the light towers a few years down the road in 1938. Fans said, okay, you got the wall. There's no way we're going to have night baseball here. This is a neighborhood. The lights are going to be shining into our windows. People from the upper deck can peer into your bedroom window. And the fans were adamant against that. Once again, the Scheibs and the Macks won out. So the light towers went up. Night baseball began in Philadelphia. It wasn't like it is now where every game was a night game. It was occasional, but that was truly the end. They never recovered from that. Their attendance never recovered. Between 1938 and 1954, when they left for Philadelphia, they only had one winning season.
Wow.
So it got to the point in the 1940s where visiting teams didn't want to come to Philadelphia because the gate receipts were not even enough to cover their expenses.
Yeah.
So it was pretty bad.
That's amazing. I read this quote one time. I don't know if it's true. Hopefully you can confirm or deny this. Once when the A's were really bad, Connie Mack was asked for a tip from a taxi driver after being taken to the stadium, and he said, quote, "Don't bet on the A's."
I've heard that more than once, so chances are that's true.
That's
because
amazing.
Connie did have a dry sense of humor. He had some wit to him. You have to remember, by the end of his career, he was already starting to get senile. His mental acuity was gone. There were times, even in the mid-1930s and into the 40s, where he would be sleeping on the bench. His coaches would be running the game.
So that's something I wanted to ask you about, because another knock against Connie Mack was that it wasn't all him. Like, he did have great coaches, and sometimes his players would even perform the duties normally carried out by a manager, like we talked about with Harry Davis. But some of his other coaches throughout the course of Connie Mack's managerial tenure is Eddie Collins, Kid Gleason, who is a World Series winning manager, Matt Kilroy, who we mentioned earlier, and a guy named Lena Blackburn.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Lena Blackburn and what he meant not only to Connie Mack in the athletics, but to baseball history.
Well, Lena Blackburn was a journeyman. He played for Connie Mack in the 1930s. Lena was his nickname. Russell Lena Blackburn lived in South Jersey, in Burlington County, New Jersey. And he lived along a tributary to the Delaware River. And nobody knows the site for sure because it was always top secret. But they always had trouble rubbing down the new baseballs before games. There was a sheen on them and they were very shiny and slippery. So no matter what the umpires tried to do before the game, the ball just didn't feel right. So one day Blackburn brought some of this mud that he found by his farm in South Jersey to Shibe Park. And he rubbed the baseball up with the mud. And it took the sheen off, and it gave especially the curveball pitchers a good grip on the ball. So Blackburn decided, you know what, I have something here. So he decided to start bringing in that mud by 5-gallon buckets. So he and his wife started to market and sell it to different teams in the majors and minors. That mud is still used around Major League Baseball to this day.
Right.
It's called Lena Blackburn Baseball Rubbing Mud. It's still sold in these little jars. Apparently one jar will last for an entire year. Either the umpires or the club or the umpire attendants rub them up before the games, just a small amount to rub up one ball. And apparently only a handful of people know where this secret stash of mud is.
Yeah.
But it's somewhere not far from here.
Yeah.
It flows into the Delaware River.
So they say that a sign of true intelligence is being able to admit what you don't know. So was that the case with Connie Mack, that he was aware of his own limitations as a manager and would surround himself with people who filled those gaps?
I would assume so, yeah. He was always surrounded by very intelligent people. That's why he really valued college-educated players as well. Most of the guys that performed coaching duties for him were very intelligent. We go back to Harry Davis, Eddie Collins, obviously. Ira Thomas was a captain for him and coach. Ira Thomas maintained a friendship with Mack throughout the rest of Mack's life. He coached for him, was a scout for him, was a business partner. He really valued those types of relationships. Matt Kilroy, like we talked about earlier, the 19th century pitcher who owned the saloon behind the right field wall, he actually was a de facto pitching coach for a number of years for Connie Mack. He worked with some of his young pitchers. So Mack always valued that, and he always surrounded himself with good people. And obviously we talked about Kid Gleason, who went to the World Series with the White Sox, and Jimmy Dykes, too. I mean, who took over for Connie when Connie finally retired after the 1950 season. He would admit when he was wrong, but it didn't happen very often.
Right, yeah.
He was very stubborn.
Yeah. So when the Athletics finally did leave Philadelphia, what was the last straw? Was it a money thing? Was it attendance? What happened?
It was very complicated. They wanted a new ballpark. After the war, the neighborhood started to go downhill a little bit. There's no parking. People were starting to drive. There's no place to park because the ballpark was in a neighborhood. So people were moving out into the suburbs. They were driving. They didn't want to drive into that neighborhood in North Philly. Attendance was pretty much non-existent. Average game would see maybe like 1,400 tickets sold, if that. They were getting overtures from other people to buy the team and move them across the river into Jersey was one rumor, to build a new ballpark out there. One rumor was to build a ballpark near 30th Street Station, where the Phillies looked at one point too later on. And there was a power struggle within the Mack family as well, because he had children from 2 marriages. By 1952, 53, he was not only not managing, he was basically not himself.
Right.
His mental acuity was pretty much non-existent then. He was really suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia by that time. And the children were fighting over control of the team.
But not ownership of the team. He never owned the team, did he?
After the Shibes sold out their main shares, he was the primary. Near the end, he was the primary, yeah. But the Shibe sons and the Shibe family still had a portion of control of the team, but not the majority. So it was a power struggle.
Yeah.
One son wanted to sell out. He wanted to get rid of all the shares and just unload the team.
Yeah.
The other one wanted to keep the team and build a new ballpark. And Arnold Johnson moved in, the businessman, and bought the team and eventually moved it to Kansas City.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really
the ending that franchise deserved.
Yeah, it wasn't really the ending. There weren't many tears shed at the time because everything had been so bitter the last few years. But with each passing year, people grew more and more fond of the A's and missing the A's.
Yeah.
Because the Phillies were not any good at that time either.
Right.
I mean, from 1918 and 1948, the Phillies only had one winning season.
Right.
So we're talking 31 years. They had one winning season.
Right.
So the Phillies weren't great either. So there was some bad baseball in Philadelphia at the time.
Yeah.
But as the years passed, a lot of the old timers said that the wrong team moved. They said the Phillies should have left and the A's should have stayed. But you know, it's
hindsight's 2020.
Hindsight's 2020. They said the same thing in Boston when the Braves left because the Red Sox were horrible then. They said the Red Sox should have been the team that went. So.
Right. Shibe Park burned in the 1970s, and photojournalists went inside and saw the wreckage, but most of what was destroyed were the recent additions.
Yes.
The original signature tower and cupola, elements of the French Renaissance design, still stood.
Yes.
Then what happened?
The last game was October 1st, 1970. The fire occurred in 1971. The ballpark just stood empty until 1976. It was basically used by the local homeless, by squatters. Vandals would go in there, kids would go in there and mess around. It turned into a dump for vagrants and vandals to go in there and do their thing. And it was an eyesore for the neighborhood. And the neighbors were basically threatening to sue the city to have the ballpark removed. And in 1976, for the country's bicentennial, the Phillies were hosting the Major League Baseball All-Star Game that year.
Right.
The bicentennial is happening and the main celebrations in Philadelphia. So you have all these eyes of the nation and the world on Philadelphia.
Right.
And you have this eyesore standing at 21st and Lehigh. And finally, this demolition company was hired by the city to finally demolish the tower. The ballpark and the tower eventually was the last thing to go. For many old-timers, for many people who saw quite a few games there, it was a sad time.
Yeah.
And it was just a beautiful piece of architecture
Right.
in its original form. Because like you said, after the numerous expansions, when the A's expanded the park in 1925 and then made numerous expansions into the 1930s, the park still had a lot of charm, but a lot of the new additions to the exterior really took away from the original facade.
Yeah.
Because the ballpark in its original form was a true architectural marvel. It was
Right.
so pleasing to the eye.
Especially at the time.
Yeah, it was phenomenal.
When you think of the legacy of Shibe Park, of Connie Mack, of the Philadelphia Athletics, what do you think that legacy is, and what do you think that legacy should be?
The legacy should be that they contributed so much to modern baseball and the way baseball is played today. Because today all we hear was analytics, right? Connie Mack was basically the originator of that. He basically was the first to value high on base percentage and hitting behind the base runner, not striking out. And he actually was one of the first to start using a bullpen, because later on with the second dynasty, guys didn't throw as many complete games as his earlier teams did. He relied heavily on his relief pitchers. So he was one of the first managers to introduce heavy bullpen usage. And a lot of it, too, was by necessity. It wasn't by design, because outside of Lefty Grove, he didn't have a lot of guys that were superstar pitchers at the time. You know, Rube Wahlberg was a good pitcher. Art Mahaffey was a good pitcher. But they just weren't guys that were going to throw complete games, like 25, 30, 35 complete games a year.
Right.
So he relied heavily on bullpens later on in his career. So he basically was almost like the father of modern baseball.
Yeah.
And in terms of Shibe Park was the first truly modern Major League Baseball park with its amenities. How they had separate restrooms for men and they had double for ladies. They had parlors in there for the women, like sitting areas in the ladies' restrooms, the parking garage, the team store, the dining room, the restaurant. It was a marvel. It was a modern marvel at the time. It was just a great franchise that was well run in the beginning, but there were some low periods too. But every franchise has ups and downs.
Right. But most franchises' ups aren't as high as the Philadelphia Athletics' ups. When they were at the top, they were at the top.
Twice.
Right. For extended periods. It wasn't just, we won a World Series once, like the Florida Marlins.
Yeah.
And then went away for 15 years. They were 5 straight years the best team in baseball, 2 different times.
Yep. And unfortunately, because of circumstances, each dynasty could have lasted a couple more years.
Yeah.
He broke apart 2 dynasties, and I truly believe that each of those dynasties could have lasted another 2 to 3 years. Because the players are still young, especially his second dynasty.
Right.
Most of those guys were in their primes.
Right.
The first one, guys like Eddie Plank and Chief Bender, and a lot of his pitchers, and Jack Combs is already gone. So his pitching fell off. But the second dynasty could have played another 2 or 3 years together.
Yeah.
I mean, Mickey Cochran went, and Jimmy Fox went, and Lefty Grove.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. When they were at the top, they were at the top. And that second dynasty, those teams were some of the greatest teams of all time.
Yeah.
But when you hear Connie Mack, when you read some of his interviews, that first dynasty, the 1910, 1911 team, those were his favorite teams. And I think he mostly says that because he remembered them better.
Right. And it was his first real taste of success.
Right. By the 1920s, he was already starting to decline a little mentally. So, there was rumors that later on in his career, he would be sitting on the bench or he would fall asleep on the bench and somebody would nudge him, we need to get a pinch hitter. And he would wake up from his sleep and he would yell out Baker's name or Collins's name. And this is in the 1930s when those guys had been long since retired.
Right.
So he definitely stayed on longer than he should have. After 1932-33, honestly, he should have turned over the reins. But who knows?
Right.
Who knows if different ownership, different leadership had the team stayed. I've had a discussion with a couple of friends of mine who are part of the local Sabre chapter. Chicago can support 2 teams right now. I mean, New York is obviously, the biggest city in the country, but Los Angeles can support 2 teams. Would Philadelphia have been able to support 2 teams today? Because you would have had loyalty. The A's would have had their loyal fans. The Phillies would have had their loyal fans, like in Chicago with the White Sox and the Cubs. I say yes, but, we'll never know.
Right. Is there one piece of memorabilia or an artifact or something from the Philadelphia Athletics history that you wish you could have?
Well, a couple of the original chairs from Shibe Park, and also an original brick or the cornerstone from Shibe Park, or a piece of the original scoreboard. For example, if a number still existed from the original.
That would be awesome.
Because the original scoreboard was along the left field wall. They had scoreboards afterwards along the right field wall back in the 50s and then into the 60s. But the original scoreboard, when the park first opened, just a piece of that scoreboard.
Yeah.
Like one of the team's nameplates or a number or something.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
There's got to be some in existence somewhere. An original program that was sold during the first game. Because inside of that program is a photo of Joe Jackson.
Right.
That spring training with Amos Strunk and Heine Heitmuller.
Yeah.
That would be a treasure to find as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You started a website and you're going through the 1910 season, game by game. Explain what you're doing there and why you're doing it and how people can check it out.
I've wanted to start a website, my own blog, for a few years now. I used to contribute to a number of websites over the years. And my wife and others said, just start your own blog, start your own site. I finally did earlier this year in April. I didn't think we would have a Major League Baseball season this year. So I figured I'd satisfy my thirst for baseball and others by doing a daily recap of the 1910 Athletics, because that team had always fascinated me. That was Connie Mack's first championship as well. Doing basically a write-up of every game, a game recap based on newspaper accounts of different newspapers, and just doing my own write-up and recap of every game with a box score and with scores of all the other Major League games from that day. And I got like 25 to 30 games into the season, and I had to pause it because my kids are always at home.
Right.
The work schedule has changed and stuff, so I had to kind of put that on pause. So now that one child is back to school in person, another one is going to be soon. I'm going to start that up again, so I'm a little behind now. My plan was to do every day for that day. So if there was a game on April 23rd, 1910, to write it up on April 23rd, 2020. The next day, like you wake up in the morning, you see the write-up from the previous day's game. So now I have a lot of catching up to do. And eventually I'm going to add other stuff to there as well about the Phillies, about the rich history of black baseball teams in Philadelphia, such as the Philadelphia Giants, the Philadelphia Stars. Not many people realize or know the history of the Philadelphia Giants, who actually played at Columbia Park. They shared Columbia Park with the Athletics. They played their home games there when the Athletics were on the road. Because back then, Major League road trips would last a month.
Right.
Because you would go out west by train. So the A's would go to Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, and then come back around and go to Boston and New York.
Right.
So teams would be gone like 3 to 4 weeks at a time. So while they were gone, the Philadelphia Giants would play at Columbia Park. And that team had Rube Foster, Pop Lloyd, Pete Hill, and Danny McClellan. And Foster, Lloyd, and Hill were all Hall of Famers.
Right.
So that was one of the greatest teams of all time as well.
Did that agreement to use the Athletics home park continue on when they moved to Shibe, or was it only in Columbia that happened?
The Philadelphia Giants, as they were pretty much done after the 1909 season. They were not the same anymore. They came back in a different form, but once Rube Foster left for Chicago, it was pretty much the beginning of the end for them. Pop Lloyd went other places too. When you had a great black baseball team back then, they weren't bound by the reserve clause.
Right.
And they were mostly barnstorming teams. Pop Lloyd said one time, we went where the money was.
Of course.
Satchel Paige would say the same thing.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even finish a season.
Right.
They might just hop and go to somebody else because somebody gave them more money.
Right.
So that team was actually held together for quite a few years, and they won, I believe, 4 or 5 black championships in a 6 or 7 year span. They were a great team. And they would often play exhibitions against the Athletics after the athletic season was over. And they would hold their own. Those games were pretty evenly matched.
Yeah.
That team had some talent. So I just wanted to eventually add more than just the 1910 season to my website. And not just Philadelphia, just other interesting stories that come to mind, interesting ideas. I've been working with a local gentleman, Mark Carfagno, on the committee to get Dick Allen to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
You want to talk about travesties. He should have been in for 35, 40 years. He should have been in. What happened to him was totally uncalled for. I know a lot of it was the media didn't particularly care for him. They were the ones that voted. But it's time to fix that because you look at the numbers, look at the OPS plus for his era. He's right there with Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. People say, well, he didn't have the home runs, but he didn't play as long as those guys did.
Right.
Doesn't matter. He didn't hit 500 home runs. You look at the averages and the numbers, he's right up there.
And when you talk to his contemporaries and the people who pitched against him, he was feared.
Yep.
He wasn't just some guy who like, oh yeah, he had a couple good years.
Yep.
He was a dominant force for a long time.
Goose Gossage played with him in Chicago with the White Sox, and he said he was the greatest hitter I ever played with. Chuck Tanner, who managed him with the White Sox, said he basically saved baseball on the South Side.
Yeah.
I've had conversations with Chris Wheeler, who was a former Phillies broadcaster. We talked at a baseball banquet about Dick Allen. Dick Allen was one of his favorite players growing up, and he said when you went to a game at Connie Mack Stadium in the 1960s, the Phillies could be losing 10-1.
Mm-hmm.
But if Dick Allen had one more at-bat coming up, you didn't leave until he finished his at-bat because you never knew where he was going to hit the ball.
Right.
People would come early to watch him take batting practice.
Yeah.
He was that great of a hitter and a power hitter. And some of the balls that he hit, some of the old-timers still talk about those balls. Yeah. And he wasn't using like a 31-ounce toothpick like they do today. He was using a club.
Right.
So eventually I'm going to add other stuff to there as well. There's so much interesting baseball history to talk about. Like there was one exhibition game in Philadelphia where Babe Ruth was recruited to go play an amateur game. The Yankees were in town against the Athletics. And then after the game, a car whisked him off to Kensington in another section of Philadelphia to play an exhibition game to raise money for a Catholic church to pay for a ball field. And there's a photo of him in the uniform for Ascension Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. A player today would never dare dream about doing something like that.
Right. Nor would they be allowed to.
Were they allowed to. Yeah. Exactly. Their contracts would not allow that. But
right.
There's so much interesting history, and I just want to keep adding it and sharing it with the readers, whoever may be interested in learning more about baseball history and even some of the smaller and unknown stories that have fallen by the wayside and forgotten by time. I just want to keep some of those stories alive and some of those old memories alive with some of the forgotten players of yesteryear.
So where can people find that website, and how can people follow you on social media if they want to keep up with the stuff you're working on?
Well, the website is whiteelephantbaseball.com.
How did you come up with that name?
The White Elephant.
It's amazing that it was available.
Yeah, it was available. Yeah, it was meant to be, I guess it was. They can follow me on social media, on Twitter, by my name. It's at Alex Cheremeteff. If you don't want to read a full article, you can follow me on Twitter for a little small tidbit, a little small paragraph. It's usually accompanied with a photo or a newspaper clipping.
You are legitimately one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter.
I just try to find something interesting every day to post on there.
Yeah.
And like I said, now that everything is starting to get back to normal, my kids are back to school, I'll be able to ramp things up again.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would have liked to have gotten to, or anything else you want to say or talk about real quick?
I just had an interesting conversation with one of my Twitter friends. He's a local guy as well. We're members of the local Sabre chapter, which is called the Connie Mack chapter. Mm-hmm. And after watching the Phillies fumble through another horrible season with all that talent that they have and 9 consecutive non-winning seasons, and the small market, low budget Athletics are in the playoffs, I said, you know what, Matt? How about we propose a trade, and not a player trade, but a franchise trade?
Wouldn't that be something?
Bring the Athletics back to the rightful home in Philadelphia and send the Phillies packing to the Bay Area.
Or wherever.
Yeah. He goes, you know what? That actually sounds like a pretty good idea. The A's seem like a more fun franchise.
Yeah.
Because the Phillies they make you want to pull your hair out. Growing up a lifelong Phillies fan, I saw some bad baseball in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And I actually sat down and thought about it. They just completed their 9th consecutive non-winning season where they have not finished above 500. Mm-hmm. The last time they had a streak worse than that was between 1933 and 1948. They had 16 consecutive non-winning seasons.
As bad as these 9 years have been, imagine doing 7 more of them.
Yep. So it's been before the Whiz Kids, actually, that they had a streak that was longer. Richie Ashburn's rookie year was 1948. That's how long it's been.
Is there end in sight to this streak?
I don't think so. It's pretty amazing where you have that kind of talent on the offensive side of the ball.
And payroll.
And you have 2 top-notch starting pitchers and a third, potentially, with the right coaching and with the talent on this team for them not to make the playoffs and finish 4 games below 500. That was kind of inexcusable. Yeah. And I think a lot of Phillies fans would agree. So it's like the old Brooklyn Dodgers saying, wait till next year.
Jimmy Fox was your favorite Athletics player of all time. Is he your favorite baseball player of all time, full stop?
I would say yes. Well, my 2 favorite, Jimmy Fox and Frank Baker. But I also loved Mickey Cochran. Growing up, I was a catcher, so I loved Mickey Cochran. But Jimmy Fox would probably be my favorite, not just because of the prodigious home runs, but he was just a genuinely nice man.
Yeah.
You would be hard-pressed to find any former player or anybody that knew him to say something negative about him.
Yeah.
He was just a genuinely nice man who always tried to help people. Unfortunately, with the way salaries were structured back then and there was no union, they didn't have a pension, he really fell in hard times later on in his life. He ended up being pretty poor. He ended up selling sporting goods at a department store in Cleveland, Ohio.
Right.
And a lot of players suffered the same fate back then. And, you know, the way he died was tragic. He was still young, asphyxiation, choking while he was eating lunch. It was just a tragic death. And one thing that bothers me, and I think it's because of the movie A League of Their Own, people think that Tom Hanks' character is loosely based on Jimmy Fox, which it kind of is. But what bothers me is when people say or think that Jimmy Fox was a drunk. And same thing about Grover Cleveland Alexander, the old Phillies pitcher and Cubs pitcher. They weren't drunks. Grover Cleveland Alexander and Jimmy Fox would go out with their teammates and have a beer just like anybody else. But Jimmy Fox didn't start drinking more heavily until pretty much the end of his career. He suffered a beating. He was barnstorming on the USA World Tour team, the one that went to Japan.
Right.
They were playing an exhibition game in Winnipeg, Canada, and he was beamed in the head. And he started sinus problems and vision problems then. And that was pretty much where he started drinking more. But he wasn't an alcoholic. And Grover Cleveland Alexander, he spent 7 weeks in the trenches on the Western Front as an artillery officer.
Yeah.
And what he saw, what he suffered from when he came back, which is what we call PTSD today. And there was no help for that back then.
Right.
He didn't have any help, no medical help. He didn't have psychological help. It was just a shame. He became an epileptic. He suffered from seizures, and he started drinking more heavily. So it bothers me when I hear people say, oh, they were drunks.
Right.
You have to realize what they went through.
Right. It's such a dismissive thing to say without knowing what the real story was.
Right. Nobody knows except for those who served with him, and he did himself what he saw in those trenches in France in 1918. And back then they called it shell shock, but it was PTSD.
Right.
I was talking about this with a friend and a colleague the other day. There was only one player that was elected to the Hall of Fame unanimously. That was Mariano Rivera. And I was saying, how could Jimmy Fox, Babe Ruth,
Right.
Ty Cobb, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays not be elected unanimously?
Especially back then, like the first class.
Like, what were you watching?
Right. These were the best players in the history of the sport at that time.
Like, Jimmy Fox got in on the first ballot, but 79.2% of the vote.
Right.
What were the other 21% watching?
Right.
Obviously, there was no television then. I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. A lot of those writers didn't see them all the time like they do today.
But to me, that's an argument for why they should be voting for him, because then all you can possibly go on is the numbers.
Right.
You don't know anything else.
Right.
And if his numbers were what they were, then what are you not voting for?
Yeah.
What did you want his numbers to be?
Yeah. There was a young player with the Red Sox that Ted Williams was tutoring, and this was at the end of Ted Williams' career. But whenever they would go on the road, they would go to Tiger Stadium or Comiskey Park or Sportsman's Park, and somebody would hit a long home run in batting practice, and the player's like, wow, did you see how far he hit that ball? And Ted Williams would say, Jimmy Fox used to hit him over there. And he would point to the most outer reaches of each ballpark, wherever they traveled to. It'd be amazing to find out how long some of those home runs were, not just Jimmy Fox, but guys like Josh Gibson and Oscar Charleston and Babe Ruth and all those guys. It'd be amazing to find out how, I mean, Babe Ruth cleared the right field pavilion at Forbes Field. No player had ever done that.
Right. And Josh Gibson was said to have hit one out of Yankee Stadium.
Right,
out
completely.
Of Yankee Stadium.
So the history of the sport is so rich, and you can talk about it forever and write about it forever.
Yeah.
And that's what I plan on doing until I can't do it any longer.
Well, we plan on listening to you talk about it and reading your work.
Reading more, yeah. Yeah, it's probably better to read me than to listen to me.
I don't know. I think today went pretty well.
We'll see.
Thank you so much for doing this and for meeting me here. And
thank you so much, Dan.
Can't
thank
tell
you
how much I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I'm glad we can get together and do this. And if I can ever be of any assistance again, please reach out and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom, who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. One of our listeners, Stuart Rosenthal, recently called this his favorite thing in all of podcasting.
Thanks, Stuart.
This is my real actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. And Mom, do you think you can say something to prove that you are my mom?
I'm the person who's probably been on the most of your Shoeless Joe field digs when you're on the hunt for Shoeless Joe dirt, tracking down all the obscure fields and then being a distraction if I need to be. And I would have to say that two of my favorite digs were when we did the road trip to Philadelphia and we were outside the site of Columbia Park and Shibe Park.
Yeah.
Those were great.
And we were joined by Ryan Lawrence on that day, so that was awesome to finally meet him. And thanks for coming along with us and seeing the sights.
It was great. We had a wonderful, informative time and met some cool guys. It was just an excellent adventure.
Yeah, and Ryan added a nice piece of the puzzle because he's from the area and a sports writer, so knows the history and gave a lot of insight to things that we didn't know just from doing the research that we did beforehand. So it was nice to have him fill in some of the gaps that we wouldn't have otherwise known. One of the things that we both noticed at Shibe Park, they do have a plaque commemorating what happened, although it was very scarcely written.
Right. One side and didn't even dip into the real stuff.
Right. For all the history that happened there, it was just like, yeah, one time a baseball field was here. But at Columbia Park, there was nothing.
Right.
And that was a real shame. So hopefully we can get something going where maybe raise a little money and get a plaque put there.
Absolutely. All three of us were like, okay, who do we need to call?
Right.
This needs to be fixed.
And forget the Shoeless Joe connection. I mean, the fact that he made his major league debut at Columbia Park and then, played at Shibe Park also in 1909. It's funny that he played 10 games for the Philadelphia Athletics, 5 of them in 1908 and 5 of them in 1909, and happened to play at both parks just because that's when his career overlapped. But forget that connection. Like, this is baseball history.
Right. It goes back to when we were speaking to Brian from Wrigley Field, and he was talking about not having any marker where the Cubs played before.
The West Side grounds, yeah.
Right. And how crazy is that? Same exact concept. And there are maybe other cities where that happens as well, and maybe we'll get to them. But again, something to be rectified. I mean, for the multi-million-dollar business, maybe it's a B business at this point.
Oh, absolutely.
How does this even happen? This is where the game got its start. It's where the people who really filled up Cooperstown to begin with, these are the guys. This is when they're hitting the dirt. We need to mark these spots.
Yep. So what did you think of the interview with Alex?
He's a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. He had me in awe with how he knew the umpire's name who made the call.
Oh, you mean Silk?
Yeah. So, Alex, kudos to you on that.
It's funny because Alex showed up with 7 books and a couple notepads of things, just so he was prepared, and didn't look at a single one of them during our interview because that's how smart he is and just his recall.
And his passion.
Right. I mean, you can tell this is something that he's been studying since he was in high school. And,
right.
It's what he knows like the back of his hand. And he told me off air that when John Thorne, the official historian of Major League Baseball, has a question about the Philadelphia Athletics, he calls Alex because he knows Alex is going to know.
I can see why. I thought it was an interesting story about how he did get involved to begin with. When he was in high school volunteering in the senior citizen home and having a lot of the guys there be World War I veterans. So they're born in the late 1800s, and they had to have been born pretty much within the first couple of years of the 1900s because they fought in World War I. But they're there when Columbia Park is still being played in. And then when Shibe Park is built, and this is the veterans' key time, your memories are strongest from when you're younger like that. And those are the names that stand out. And so he's hearing about these fantastic players, these icons of baseball, through the eyes of people who were eyewitnesses to them playing or ear witnesses to hearing about them playing. And their passion then puts him in the direction of going to the library back in the day, hauling around that epic book,
Total Baseball
Encyclopedia. And
written by John Thorne.
I like the way he said he'd get up before everyone else in the house and sit there eating a bowl of cereal, reading stats.
You're either that type of person or you're not. And I think most of the people who listen to this podcast are that type of person. Maybe not waking up at 5 a.m. with a bowl of cereal to read the statistics, but the people listening to this right now are the people who are interested in that kind of stuff and want to learn the history and want to know as much as they possibly can about these players and about these stories. And that's what makes this podcast cool to me, is that We talk to the people who did the research or were there or,
And we may possibly resemble them in a little bit. Part of his recall, it was almost like he was a jukebox for athletics trivia, and you drop your quarter in the slot by showing him a black and white image of Cobb sliding into third, and boom, he gives you all the background about what exactly happened at Bennett Park in Detroit, August 24th, 1909. They're playing the Tigers. Frank Baker's on third base, how he's holding his glove, what he's doing with it, what's happening to Ty's foot, and it was
and the visitors' dugouts on the first base side, so Connie Mack didn't have a great vantage point.
Right.
Like, okay, man.
Yeah, and he hadn't had lunch yet, so he was kind of cranky. It was amazing how he brought the photo to life. Mm-hmm. And that's what historians do. They take something that you just flip through and they delve deep and make the image become something that talks about the people in that image and brings it back to life all these years later.
And give it the context. Anybody can just flip through a book. He mentioned the Charles Conlon book of photos. That's an incredibly interesting book if there were no words. But what makes that book so cool is the caption and the story behind some of the photographs. Like, a lot of them are portraits, so it isn't an action shot, but the ones that are action shots, you're like, okay, this happened on such and such a game, and here's the exact play that is being photographed.
And here we are, we're discussing it 100 years later.
Yeah.
But talking about making it come alive or looking at the images, like you were just saying about Conlon's, in this one, you see the ump trying to run closer in to see the play, and even though it's a black and white still, there's motion there. I love studying the black and white photos. I think they're just so great. It's so interesting to see what people are doing, like Man Cave and other places that are colorizing them. Just, again, bringing them to life.
And as you're listening to this, go to the website and go to the liner notes so you can see the exact image that we're talking about, because the image of Ty Cobb sliding into third base that you have in your mind right now is not the one we're talking about. That is the Charles Conlon photo, which is one of the most famous baseball photographs ever taken, probably the most famous. That is also Ty Cobb sliding into third base, where he looks like he's about to spike the third baseman's arm. But the one that Alex was talking about that was taken against the Philadelphia Athletics at Bennett Park was taken by William Kunzel. So I've got the photo up on our liner notes so you can see exactly what we're talking about and see the angle that shows it looked like he was trying to avoid the tag and not going spikes up at Frank Baker's hand or forearm. Happened to catch it, but like Alex said in the interview, that was probably because Baker was trying to make the tag and going aggressively at Ty. So,
reaching over him, yeah.
Yeah.
When you know the history of the Philadelphia Athletics, which that was another thing I thought was interesting, Alex, for the most part, referred to them as the Athletics, mm-hmm. because I would always think of it as the A's, and how he would also refer to Connie Mack. It was always just Connie. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't need to say more than that, because Connie Mack equals the Philadelphia Athletics.
Yeah.
So it really becomes the Connie Mack story in so many ways, because he shapes not only the team, but the physical location of where they're playing. He's an active part of helping Ben Scheib decide. They've already grown out of Columbia Park in just a short time, and they obtain land through the secret dealings, which is a very cool story also. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, they're exactly right, because boom, as soon as word gets out, developers come in and swoop up and build those row houses, which are still standing. So that was kind of cool. I know you'll probably have a picture of Scheib Park also in the liner notes. Mm-hmm. And it truly is a palace of baseball. Even if Alex hadn't talked about all the modern amenities that were put into it and how it really was no longer wooden bleachers and wooden grandstands, it was reinforced concrete and steel. It had so many advantages for fans and for players. The tunnel going underground for the players to safely get to the locker room from the dugout without being harassed or bothered by fans. And I don't mean bothered like they don't want to interact with the fans, mm-hmm. but at times it could get out of hand where mm-hmm. they were attacked by fans. Yeah. And so it was a safety feature in a lot of ways. The idea of public restrooms and how there were twice as many for the women. So Connie Mack's vision there, the gift shop, merchandising. Obviously it wasn't enough because, it didn't help him out when he wasn't accepting advertising for the field or not doing beer sales. That's just cruel to be located in Brewery Town mm-hmm. and not do beer sales.
But they made up the white elephant logo and turned that into a big merchandising thing with the pennants and all sorts of other merchandise like that. So
Brilliant.
They might have missed out on money in certain aspects, but they definitely made it up in other ways. And I'm sure, just like baseball teams do today, they were lying about how much money they were and were not making, because that's what teams do. You can't convince your fans to pay a higher ticket price one year compared to the last year if they think that you're making a ton of money. So you've got to say, guys, if you want us to put a better product on the field, if you want us to continue paying these high salaries to these Triple Crown winning players, we got to raise ticket prices. We got to do this. We got to do that.
Yeah, but did you hear the numbers of how many years they went without anything? So I don't know. I couldn't help think of Doc Adams, listening to some of Connie Mack's attributes, just looking at how closely their lives overlapped. So Doc Adams' Laws of Baseball were written down by Doc in 1857, right? Mm-hmm. So Connie Mack's born in 1862, so shortly thereafter, but they definitely had overlap. So Connie becomes a player in 1886. He's still in the early years. I mean, he's not the pioneer years, but they're still trying to figure out how you become the best player you can be. And he has the same analytical mind that Doc does. Mm-hmm. He looks at things and analyzes them and comes up with the idea that I need guys to get on base. He logically thinks it through. Do we put a new pitcher with a different catcher at every time, depending on whose turn it is in the rotation? Mm-hmm. Well, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we have, since they are such a critical part of the game, why wouldn't we match a pair who have camaraderie, who get along, who, the catcher understands, knows how to cajole and get the pitcher to work the way he needs to be worked? They're partners. Mm-hmm. It's the battery. He gets that.
Right.
So why would you change that and walk away from that? Bullpens, fine-tuning and getting the concept down. Things that we take for granted today because they've been around seemingly forever. Mm-hmm. But no, somebody had to figure that out, just like Doc had to figure out we need a guy at shortstop.
Right.
And we need the bases to be uniform in every field that we play at. So it's going to be 90 feet and the beauty of the symmetry. These two guys were very similar in what their minds held and what they brought to the game because of it.
When you talk about the longevity of each of their careers and the overlap, one of my favorite things from when Vince Scully retired, from 1886 until 2016, there was not a single baseball season that happened where either Connie Mack or Vince Scully wasn't involved.
Oh, my God. My head just went...
1950 was Connie Mack's last season, and that was Vince Scully's first season. Vince Scully actually broadcast a spring training game in 1950 with Connie Mack as the A's manager. Mack's first game was 1886, and Vince Scully retired in 2016. Every single year between those two numbers featured a baseball season with either Connie Mack or Vince Scully.
Wow.
130 years. That's crazy.
It was really interesting. It was almost like being on a treasure hunt to figure out with the information we had, which was kind of vague about Columbia Park. That was our first stop, trying to figure out what was the orientation, where was home plate in that land parcel, because there's no marker, there's no clue as to where it would have been.
And since then, homes have been built where the field was, and another street ran through where the field was, so unless you know, there's no way to be able to deduce just by looking at what is there present day.
Right. So the research that we did before going, it gave us the outline of the bordering streets, but it did not say what was the orientation. Mm-hmm. And so...
Luckily, we had Alex in our corner.
Right. And we were trying to figure it out, and it was very cool. And then you figure out, okay, well, if Joe's playing the outfield, where would he be standing? And that's, of course, where you're trying to collect field dirt. Mm-hmm. So... It's neat to see that those row houses are there, and we actually stopped and talked to two gentlemen whose grandmother bought one of the houses that was built when Columbia was torn down, and they still live there, and that was great. It was a neat little thing. We spent a lot of time with them.
And they didn't know the history. They thought they had heard about a baseball field or something, but didn't realize their house was in the footprint of the field, and didn't realize that it was the Philadelphia Athletics who were this great dynasty of baseball. And like you said, it was their grandmother's original home. So I think that was built in 1911.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, because the final year was 1908, and they demolished it soon thereafter and started building the houses. So yeah, I think it was either 1910 or 1911 where that house was built, and she was the original owner. So something that had been in their family for over 110 years.
Right.
And they didn't really know the history through no fault of their own.
Right.
If that...
Shame on Philadelphia.
Right.
And these were sports guys. They were college athletes, and they knew sports history, and they were just shocked.
Yeah.
And that's when the conversation started about how we as a society, and we, maybe as Shoeless Joe, make it a mission to try and save these spots and mark them in the way that they deserve.
Yeah.
When Alex was talking about the 1910 World Series and how that was one of the best teams that the Athletics ever put on the field, Alex said that there were only 2 pitchers used during that World Series, a 5-game series. What does that say about today's pitchers?
Well, I don't think it's the pitcher's fault today. From a very early age, these kids are put on pitch limits and pitch counts and innings limits. And if you've never thrown more than 70 pitches in your life, by the time you get to high school, you're not all of a sudden going to be able to throw 210 pitches in a game. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the upper levels of baseball where the hitters are so good and you need to have a specialization to be able to get them out. Then it just becomes like an analytics game where, okay, this guy's a left-handed batter, so we need a left-handed pitcher to come and get him. But he likes fastballs, so we need a left-handed guy who throws a bunch of junk. And the next guy who comes up to the plate is right-handed, and he likes junk. So it's just such a specialized sport today that...
It really is. It's so precise.
Right. I think the game will never go back to the way it was because it can't. The players are too talented and their skills are too refined. When you take a look at most high school teams, the best pitcher is usually one of the best hitters on the team too, because he's just the best athlete. Mm-hmm. He doesn't know how to throw the true pitches that a major league pitcher knows how to throw. He's just really good at throwing hard because he's a young athlete.
Yeah.
But by the time he gets to college, okay, now he starts to get a little bit specialized and doesn't hit quite as much and doesn't practice hitting as much because he's trying to rest his arm and trying to be on a throwing program. By the time he gets to the majors, he hasn't picked up a bat in 5 years. And when he was 17, he's the best hitter on his team. And now he looks like he's never held a bat in his life before. Mm-hmm. I just don't see that change going back the other way. The game is just so different than it was in the early 1900s.
Yeah, parents today are going, what? You can't leave my son in there for all those pitches.
Mm-hmm. Or the other side of it is you have guys like Blake Snell on the Tampa Bay Rays, who is incredibly upset at his manager for pulling him after 5 innings in the World Series because I can keep going.
Yeah.
But the numbers say, no,
right.
I should make the change now. And it's like, yeah, but coach, I'm mowing them down.
Right.
And I don't know if that's good or bad for baseball. People say that managerial decision cost them the World Series, but those managerial decisions all that season got them to the World Series. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, in that moment, it was probably the wrong move. But if that's what had worked all year long to get this garbage payroll team to the 6th game of the World Series, how do you, at that point, decide, no, I'm going to go against what we've been doing? People say it's the eye test, and you can just tell he was throwing great and he wasn't floundering, and it was just the second time through the order, so why not keep him in? But I get why that move was made. I don't think I would have made the same move, but again, if that's what you've been doing all season long and it had clearly worked since you were in that position to make the move in the first place, I understand it.
When Alex was talking about the white elephant sweater, which is such a cool story and looks awesome. I mean, even out of baseball, that could be a phenomenon just in the world of clothing. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a pretty cool thing. And I love how Alex collected the pieces and then has them, and it's like, okay, well, now what? He talks about, we have this nostalgia store here in Philadelphia. And I just had to smile because I don't know, does this mean we are such geeks that we know it's Mitchell and Ness? Mm-hmm. And when he says Mitchell and Ness, it's like, really? You didn't think anybody listening to this podcast is going to know about your little nostalgia store? Mm-hmm. I guess they got their start in Philly, so it's a little hometown pride going on.
And the fact that you can actually go into the store there. There isn't a Mitchell and Ness store in every single mall in America. It still is kind of a specialty shop, and yeah, you can get stuff online, but the flagship store is in Philadelphia, so I think there is some hometown pride there.
So you know what I'm hearing? We have to go back to Philadelphia. I thought as a White Sox fan, it was interesting to hear about Eddie Collins and how he really rose to his stardom before he came into the White Sox organization. Mm-hmm. And what a key player he was and how he was crafted by Connie Mack, basically.
Yeah. Well, the infield on those early dynasty teams is thought to be one of the best infields ever assembled. They were called the $100,000 infield, and they didn't disappoint. They came up with the multiple World Series titles, and those players that were part of that team were some of the best in baseball history, and Eddie Collins obviously one of them. a 3,000 hit guy and multiple World Series titles on multiple teams. So yeah, just a great collection of talent put together by Connie Mack and his scouts. And that was something that I found interesting too, was hearing all of the people who helped Connie Mack become Connie Mack. You know, his coaches all had interesting stories too, from Harry Davis to Lena Blackburn to, you know, all these guys, where they weren't just washed up players who their former manager or former owner was throwing them a bone by keeping them on the staff. I mean, these guys were brilliant men who had talent and foresight and side hustles, creating tarp and creating the baseball mud. And, you know, they were not just thinking, how can I make my players better? They were thinking, what can I do to make the sport better and give my team an advantage all the time? Not just this player, but the team.
Right. And advancing the game. You know, Lena Blackburn with his baseball mud. I didn't realize that was a thing. Mm-hmm. And it's still a thing today.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Or even the story of Howard Emke.
Right.
He's got a dead arm. Okay, well, you're still on the team. Go be useful. Go scout the team we're going to play in the World Series in a month.
Right.
And he goes out and watches them play, comes back and says, hey, I think I can go. I know what I need to do, and they can't hit me. And wins a game in the World Series after not having thrown a baseball in weeks. And that was the difference. Even that story, Connie Mack knew who to trust and then trusted them in the spots where it was necessary to do that.
It's why we love this game. There are just so many stories and so much history, but it's not extraordinary things. It's something like that, where just figuring it out and then rising to the occasion, having faith in yourself and confidence in yourself, and then rising to the occasion to make something great. The other part of Columbia Park and No Marker, when Alex was talking about the Negro League's Philadelphia Giants playing there, Rube Foster played there. Forget everything else we just said.
Right.
You need a marker there.
Right.
You have these names and you mark the spots where this greatness happened. When Alex was talking about his favorite players, and he talked about Jimmy Foxx and some of the sad stories that hit his life at the end, but how he was just such a powerhouse and such a great player in his prime. And his prime kind of hits a wall when Connie Mack decides, no player's worth more than this amount. And so even though you are in your prime and even though you just won the Triple Crown, I still have this magic number in my head that it's going to be.
His prime didn't hit the wall. His good graces with his manager hit the wall. He was just entering his prime, you know, and thanks to the reserve clause, he had no recourse. You can ask for a raise, but if you don't have an agent and you don't have free agency and you don't have anything like that where you have a recourse.
Right, but they had the momentum. And like Alex said, they probably had 2 or 3 years left in their run. So, you know, I'm a Blackhawks fan. I know about letting a run go and letting it keep on going. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but they had the momentum. And when Connie and Jimmy Foxx have that conversation, that kind of ends that dynasty then. It's the beginning of the end. So yes, he still went on, but he could have gone on with that championship team, and it would have been a whole different story. But what I didn't realize, even though I've seen the movie League of Their Own probably 100 times, literally, is that the Tom Hanks character is based on Jimmy Foxx. And I thought it was very helpful and good to know to hear Alex talk about the backstory of Jimmy Foxx and the backstory of Grover Cleveland Alexander, putting it in perspective of how they ended up their lives because of what they lived through. And I think that's an important asterisk to include in their life stories and how we think of them today.
And Jimmy Dugan, Tom Hanks' character in A League of Their Own, was loosely based on Jimmy Foxx. He was a former slugging major league player who came to manage the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League team. But from all the accounts that I've read and that have been recorded, Jimmy Foxx did not act as crude and as crassly as Tom Hanks' character in that movie did towards his players. He was a gentleman still, and even though he still did drink a little bit, he wasn't the fall-down drunk sleeping in the dugout during games that Jimmy Dugan was. He was just not Jimmy Foxx anymore.
Right, and it happens to so many people in so many careers. When you're in a public space like that, it's just a little bit more highlighted. But knowing the backstory, it gives you pause before you start thinking of someone in a certain way. So this is good. It was very helpful to know that. And with Grover Cleveland Alexander and being in the trenches on the Western Front, how he was even able to function after coming out of that. There were so many who weren't.
Right. talking about the architecture of Shibe Park, and the church that is on the grounds where Shibe Park once stood mimics the window style of the old Shibe Park windows. So that was kind of cool. And we have a photo of the old Shibe Park. And when we were there, we were able to look, he held it up and could see, oh yeah, they absolutely made it look similarly in style. So that was cool. And just knowing how beautiful that place must have been in its prime. You see those old pictures of it and the cupola and all the architectural details. You called it a palace of baseball. Well, Comiskey Park was known as the baseball palace of the world, but Shibe Park was absolutely a beautiful place.
Structure, absolutely. It's a shame to lose buildings like that it couldn't have been repurposed for something, because that was some beautiful architecture on it.
And then the story of the spite fence sounds a lot like another Chicago baseball team. The Cubs owners and cut us in on your rooftop sales. No, you don't want to? Okay. I think a scoreboard's going up in front of your rooftop next year. We'll see how your ticket sales are affected that way. Apparently a story as old as time in terms of baseball history. So this was in the 1930s, and here we are 90 years later and having the exact same story in Chicago. So profits over everything, right?
Yep. When you look at the liner notes and you see some of the photographs of the fans attending the World Series games at Columbia Park or Shibe Park, and you see them, sitting on the rooftops of the row houses, to me, does not mean sitting on the actual parapet that's hanging, that it has all this architectural detail, meaning it is not just a flat surface. There aren't benches, there aren't chairs. They're sitting on these curved, molded concrete places that, oh my God, get down from there. Oh, I don't think I would be able to do that. Yeah. And then you look at the spectators who are sitting on the lower level, thinking, okay, they are packed to the max on those surfaces to catch those games.
Pretty wild.
My last comments would be, it was amazing listening to Alex share his passion. That was great. And I loved being able to see the spaces. Again, always meaningful to, I think, both of us to be in the space, be as close to it as possible, because it gives you a different depth of understanding. Yes, you can look at photographs. Yes, you can look at black and white photographs, but to be on the street where those row houses were, for example, and see them in the black and white photograph and then look up and you're standing right next to them is very cool.
And it's the same house. It's not like they were rebuilt in that style. They are still standing.
Right.
Yeah.
Learning so much about Connie Mack, and somehow I have a disconnect between the Philadelphia Athletics and Connie Mack's teams from that era and the Oakland A's, even though it is the same franchise. But to me, I never put those together. I don't think of it as being the precursor. And I'm not sure why I have that disconnect, but it's two separate things. And it took some listening to Alex go through some different things to pull those together and think of it as it's the same franchise. It just bops around.
He mentioned it for a second, but I didn't want to go into it further because I knew that you wouldn't be able to grasp this. But the Athletics also were in Kansas City for a chunk of time in between Oakland and Philadelphia. So we'll talk about that in a few seasons.
We'll give it a dash and an asterisk and move on.
I thought Alex's deep knowledge of the Shoeless Joe connection was interesting too. Some people know about the fact that he was even on the Athletics period, but then those who do, a handful know about Joe jumping on trains to go back and forth from Greenville, and he was homesick and all that. But for Alex to have the details and know the name of the coach who went to go get him, and that was cool.
And know that Hyder Bar put his luggage down with Joe's and only Hyder's is left. But it was interesting because Alex didn't call him Shoeless Joe. He would say Joe Jackson. I like that because it shows respect for Joe Jackson as the player he was. He was Joe Jackson, not Shoeless Joe.
Yeah. All right. Well, any final thoughts on the Alex Cheremeteff episode?
I think we need to get to Philly again for Mitchell and Ness.
Well, we went to get cheesesteaks.
Oh, yeah.
And we stopped at a restaurant called Joe's.
Right.
That was the first stop on our trip. And now all 3 episodes that we recorded on that trip have aired. We did this episode first in Philadelphia, where we stopped at Columbia Park and Shibe Park and then interviewed Alex. And then we went to Boston real quick.
Right. We stopped at Elysian Fields along the way.
To visit the site where Doc Adams played ball for a little bit. stopped in Boston real quick at the Hotel Buckminster, which is allegedly where the very first meeting between Chick Gandil and Sport Sullivan, where they hatched the idea of throwing the 1919 World Series. So that was a really cool place. We've both been to Boston a number of times, but never to that location.
Right.
And there have been grumblings over the past year that that hotel might be torn down. And we just knew, all right, we're close enough. It's not at all on our way. This is
close enough.
as close as we're going to be getting
Right.
within the next 12 months. And if it gets torn down, we got to go right now.
Right.
So we decided to do a little detour and didn't think anybody was going to be there. We tried to call ahead and say, hey, we're with the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. There's some history that was kind of involved in your hotel. Is there any way that somebody can let us in? And the guy was like, nope, we're all out of town. And so we're like, okay, well, we're still showing up. And if you hear a knock on the door and it's a horse, let the horse in and everybody go to sleep. But we pulled up and parked across the street next to a bank, and the poster in the window of the bank said, go the distance, which was a nice sign.
It was a sign.
We crossed the street, and there's a computer paper printout on the inside of the door that says, for 24-hour assistance, call this phone number. And we got there probably about 7 o'clock, close to 7:30 at night, so everything was closed already. And this is October of 2020, so we're in the middle of the pandemic still.
Right.
This was the first time that we had literally left our house since March.
And actually, the states we traveled through were on such serious lockdown that we actually had to fill out forms online with their departments of health before we could travel into some of these states. It was extremely locked down, and we were absolutely safe the whole time.
Yeah. And so I call that phone number when we get to the door, and before anybody even picks up, somebody starts walking from the inside of the building towards the door. And we're like, oh, great, he heard the phone call. He didn't. It was just the night watchman making his last round. This was the last door he needed to check before he was going home for the night. And we just happened to be standing right there calling the phone number. And he was like, what can I help you with? Why are you here? We told him the story, and we're like, we need 10 minutes. Can you just take us up to the room where we think this happened? And he's like, yeah, come on in. Okay. Thank you.
And his name was?
Joseph. Literally, we're not joking. It was literally
Right.
his name.
You can't make this up.
And so we are like, we think it happened in room 615. Nobody knows for sure, but that's the speculation over all the years. And it makes sense because that was a suite towards the corner of the building on the upper floor. And the view overlooking Fenway Park from the window was about as good a view as you could possibly have. Just an incredible room. And when you think that this is 1919 and you've got a huge suite of a hotel room with its own living room area and then a separate bathroom and a separate bedroom.
And a fireplace in the living room, a curved bay window. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it was beautiful for today. And,
Right.
think what it was 100 years ago. So the hotel was under renovation. It wasn't being torn down. It was being renovated. And so Joseph, who was taking us around, was like, all these doors should be unlocked, so let's just walk up and we'll be able to get into whatever room you want. And so we walk in, and the fireplace had been, for lack of a better word, dismantled.
Nice.
Thank you. I'll be here all week.
Right.
So there were bricks just on the ground from the hearth of the fireplace.
Right.
And so I asked Joseph, what's going to happen to those bricks? And he said, we're renovating this place. It's all garbage.
It's all debris.
If you turn around for a couple seconds, you're not going to notice that one's missing, right? He goes, no, take it. So I got a brick from room 615 of the Hotel Buckminster, which is supposedly the room
Right.
where the meeting took place. And there is speculation that maybe that meeting didn't take place actually in the hotel, or if it did, it could have been in the hotel bar or in the lobby and not actually in the bedroom. But that's the speculation. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that was amazing. And just, again, being in the space, walking up into that room, seeing the view of Fenway right there. Because for some reason, even though there was no baseball, Fenway's lights were on at that point. And then when we came down to exit and leave Joseph, our guardian angel, that night, we turn around and there's a sign that says exit to Fenway. And you went out that specific door, which is where the players would have gone, because it got you directly over to Fenway. And again, just the placement of, now you understand the proximity and why they would have met there, why the players would have stayed there, and never would have put that together without being there in that moment.
Right. Like I said, we got there probably 7 o'clock, 7:30 at night.
Right.
And weren't going to stay in Boston for the night because we needed to be in Connecticut the next day to interview Marjorie. So we just hopped in the car, and as we were driving to Connecticut, we called Hotel Buckminster to say, thank you so much, Joseph was great. And they said, there hasn't been somebody named Joseph who worked here in 85 years.
Didn't see that coming.
But no, then we interviewed Marjorie, and she was great. And we heard the Doc Adams story and all of his contributions to the game and to American culture. That was an incredible part of the trip.
Absolutely.
And then
absolutely
continued on to Baltimore, where we talked to Sean at the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum. So we did 4 cities, 3 interviews in like 84 hours, something like that.
It was intense.
And all that driving, starting in Greenville and then ending in Greenville. It was quite a little trip, but man, it was cool. And it provided us with 3 of the episodes for this season. So
it was a great road trip. There was a ton of history. There were major cities we were driving through. We drove through Philly. We drove through Washington, D.C. We drove through Baltimore. All these great cities along the eastern seaboard. 2 baseball parks, Fenway and Oriole Park at Camden Yards, which we stayed right across the street from Oriole Park and had the view. It was just great.
The 2 parks that were still standing, but then the 2 parks that weren't. In Philadelphia, we went to Shibe Park and Columbia Park. And same thing as Boston, where we'd both been there a number of times. I've been to Philadelphia probably 5 times and never once had gone to the sites of Columbia Park or Shibe Park.
Yeah.
So to finally actually go do it was cool, especially as a part of this trip.
Right. It was a thrill to be able to do it. It was a little nerve-wracking because at that time things were very intense and you didn't really know what was going to be going on, but glad we did it and did it safely. And it was just get out there and do what you can do and see what you can see.
Yeah. And that was much needed in terms of breaking up the monotony and keeping ourselves from going stir crazy. I mean, we had cabin fever. It was literally from the first week of March till this road trip was the first week in October. Mm-hmm. And the only time we left the house was to go grocery shopping or to go to a doctor or something.
Right.
So cool trip, cool interviews, cool guests. Thanks for coming, Mom.
My pleasure. I would tag along on something like that anytime. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something. Here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast. Then, find the pinned tweet at the top of our profile with the link to the Alex Cheremeteff episode, which asks this week's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in this episode you just finished listening to. Retweet that tweet along with your answer, and we'll announce the winner on the next episode of the podcast. You don't have to be first, you just have to be right. But make sure you're following us. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win an enamel pin only available to members of the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, and a hardcover copy of To Everything a Season, Shibe Park in Urban Philadelphia from 1909 to 1976 by Bruce Kuklick. The book is full of interesting stories about the stadium, the team, and the city, and has a bunch of old photos showing the groundbreaking ceremony at 21st and Lehigh in 1908, the stadium's demolition in 1976, and everything in between. There's photos of the rooftops on the row homes packed with fans watching the 1929 World Series. Lefty Grove being presented with the first modern Most Valuable Player trophy after winning the award in the American League for 1931. Franklin Roosevelt speaking at a campaign rally in October of 1944. And the famous photo of Phillies manager Ben Chapman reluctantly sharing a bat but refusing to shake hands with Jackie Robinson in May of 1947, a scene which was depicted in the movie 42. There's a photo of the Philadelphia Eagles and Chicago Cardinals playing the snow game in December of 1948, fans rushing the field after the final out of the last game in October of 1970, and firefighters attempting to extinguish the flames during the fire that gutted the stadium in August of 1971. During our interview, Alex mentioned how cool it would be to have original seats from Shibe Park. At the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, we felt the same way. We already had a seat from Comiskey Park, where Joe played his home games for the White Sox when he was in Chicago, but we wanted to get something from Philadelphia and something from League Park in Cleveland too. Since it's so hard and so expensive to obtain any authentic items which Joe used or wore during his career, one of the ways we've gotten creative at the museum is to try to find artifacts from places that Joe lived or worked or played. It's been a wild goose chase for most items, and oftentimes those chases are unsuccessful. Sometimes, though, all it's taken was a road trip, and occasionally things have just fallen into our lap. Having some nice connections has definitely helped, but a lot of luck has been involved too. Our museum is located in Greenville, South Carolina. About 30 miles east is a city called Spartanburg. If you've ever flown into the area, you've likely traversed the Greenville-Spartanburg Airport. In 1926, a baseball stadium was designed by an architect from Spartanburg named J. Frank Collins. It was built in Spartanburg that same year, and on July 8, 1926, Duncan Park hosted its first game as 2,500 people watched the Spartanburg Spartans defeat the Macon Peaches 5-1. The Spartans played there until the late 1930s. In 1933, the American Legion Post 28 baseball team began playing games there, and it remains their home field to this day. The largest crowd to ever watch a sporting event in Spartanburg gathered at Duncan Park for Game 5 of the 1936 World Series of American Legion Baseball, when nearly 21,000 fans watched Post 28 defeat Los Angeles. Duncan Park also hosted the 1938 World Series of American Legion Baseball. The Spartanburg Sluggers were a Negro League team that called Duncan Park home from 1928 to 1952. In 1937, the New York Yankees played an exhibition game at Duncan Park on their way to New York from spring training. This means that Joe DiMaggio and Lou Gehrig once played on the field. In the 1940s, the Spartanburg Peaches played their home games at Duncan Park. The Peaches were a Class B minor league affiliate of the St. Louis Browns in 1946, and then for the Cleveland Indians from 1947 to 1955. Larry Boa, Ryan Sandberg, Dale Murphy, and Tom Glavine all played at Duncan Park on their way to the big leagues, as did Negro Leaguers Hank Aaron, Satchel Paige, Jackie Robinson, and Larry Doby. Duncan Park is the oldest ballpark in South Carolina and one of the oldest wooden grandstand baseball stadiums in the nation. Thanks to all of its history, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2016. All cool, right? But what does any of this have to do with anything? I'll tell you, but first, back to Shibe Park. The Philadelphia Phillies were co-tenants at Shibe with the Athletics from 1938 until the A's left for Kansas City after the 1954 season. The Phillies were then the main tenant at the stadium until it closed in 1970. And here's the connection. Philadelphia's Class A affiliate at that time was the Spartanburg Phillies, who played at Duncan Park from 1963 to 1994. Since Shibe Park had just closed, Philadelphia management decided to send 582 wooden seats from their newly vacant stadium 600 miles south to Duncan Park before the 1971 Western Carolinas League season. It was the only minor league ballpark to receive seats from Shibe. If those seats had remained at the abandoned stadium in Philadelphia, they surely would have been vandalized, stripped away by looters, burned, or destroyed by the wrecking ball. And by an incredible amount of luck and happenstance, 582 of them were just 30 miles away from me here in Greenville, South Carolina in the year 2020. I made some calls and sent some emails, and after explaining what we were trying to do with them at the museum and why they're an important artifact related to Joe Jackson's career, I was told there would be 2 seats waiting for me to come pick up within a week. When our museum reopens, you'll be able to see those seats proudly being displayed. In the meantime, if you'd like to become a member of our museum, we would be thrilled to have you. Just go to our website, shoelessjoejackson.org, and click the tab at the top that says Join. You can pick the annual membership that fits your current budget, and you'll get some cool stuff in return. It could range from items in our gift shop to a personally guided tour around Greenville where you can see all of the spots here in town that are important to Joe's life and career. Our museum is always free to enter, but your memberships, purchases, and donations allow us to continue to operate and continue to serve our community, both in person and online. If you have questions about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, about the podcast, or about anything else, you can reach out on social media or email me at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer them in the next episode. If you want to send in a video or audio recording of your question so I can play it on the show, that's cool too. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. If you know current or former baseball players, managers, broadcasters, journalists, or if you are one, let's talk. A lot of you have liked and subscribed to My Baseball History, and we're so thankful for that. Some of you have even rated and reviewed the show, like Jack in New Mexico, who recently left us a 5-star rating and a kind review about some of the episodes he's listened to in Season 2. It's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.